All right, so we are live. Okay, so we're mostly going to talk about guns today. We're going to talk about the two videos I sent you guys, one with a police shooting and one with a home invader type shooting. And then also, if we get a chance, we're going to talk about like the Second Amendment, which I'm curious to hear if, Matt, if you are aware of your country's constitution, what you guys have similar to the U.S.'s Second Amendment. Well, and then we can break down like kind of how we think gun laws should go in our society project. But to start that off, one thing I'm trying to that I think will be worth figuring out for our society is if we imagine our hypothetical society is about the size of the U.S. with potential states or no states at all. I really want to figure out what we think our society's government should be in control of federally versus allowing individual states to have their own rules. So even though, Matt, your stances might not fully fit into this society's project, who knows, one day that this project might become your perfect ideas. I want you to give a quick 2-minute rundown on what you think a perfect society would look like, and then Jeremy, you respond to Matt, and then Phil, I'll have you hop in whenever you feel like hopping in.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I have this like a project called the Nations of Sanity. I've got a little YouTube channel and website and all that. And basically the premise of it is that crime and therefore also law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership. And the specific solution that I kind of offer through this project is to basically say that we should establish this concept as law through a peace agreement. So it's essentially the terms of peace. Because one of the things about this principle of individual self-ownership is we can't really impose law under any kind of ruling authority because that contradicts the principle. So we would have to do it as like a peace agreement. And that's how I think law should both be defined and established. And that's what my little project's about.
All right, Jeremy. And then you watched me and Matt talk on a video that was about a half hour yesterday. What did you hear anything that you think you'd either want to challenge or that you agree with from it?
I mean, that sounds reasonably close to how I think about um, the problems of human interaction. Um, I am very much an ethical consequentialist, so to the extent that I think of something like self ownership being an important moral principle, I think is a it's a useful moral principle insofar as it um, can be reliably reduced to producing greater well being than not respecting such a principle, and to the extent that its relationship to promoting happiness and positive well being and reducing suffering and strife, then it I don't hold it as a bedrock principle. So I would be compelled to move away from it if I thought that it produced overall negative consequences to hold fast to such a principle. But other than that, in fact, I do think that such a principle is a very good one to produce overall well-being. And then what I would say that the issue with states forming, with governments forming, is essentially the same problem as with gangs or powerful criminal enterprises forming, which is it's essentially an engineering problem or a game theoretic problem of how we can effectively protect freedoms against the very obvious fact that there are going to be many people who, for whatever reason, their the natural incentive structure to become criminals, psychological dispositions like sociopathy. Um, for whatever reason, there are going to be many people who are inclined um, to violate others, and so I don't see it as a matter of principally a matter of kind of shouting out your moral principles as vociferously as you can, but instead it's an engineering problem. It's a complex question of setting up incentive structures in a way that protects the well-being of individuals, the flourishing of individuals, while causing a minimum of collateral damage. And it's not going to be, in my mind, it's not going to be, even though it's good to be able to articulate the fundamental moral principle. That's not really what's going to require the most work. The most work is required in the process of figuring out the engineering hacks and the systems that work best when they're in place. And I think that anarcho-capitalism competing defense contractors, essentially, along with competing court systems or adjudication systems, has a lot of strong arguments to recommend it in terms of working better than the current, fixed central government systems that we generally have today currently work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I do kind of agree that there is the kind of utilitarian argument for this idea with regards to, I agree with you that I think it would be the best way to have a better society, but I do also stand by the sort of principle and the moral truth of it as well. So I do have a bit more of a kind of sort of devotion to that aspect of it, because one of the things I like about it is there's a kind of objective truth to the internal consistency of this principle. Like there's no contradiction when you enforce this law. It's literally defending this concept of individual self-ownership versus violating that concept of individual self-ownership. So it makes defining crime as easy as 2 + 2, or it might be more complicated, like 55,000 divided by 22, but whatever, there's an objective answer. And sometimes it might take a little bit more calculating, if you like, if it's a more complex issue, but there's always an objective answer based on this moral truth that you're working from. And it doesn't guarantee that crimes won't happen, but it's like, we've still got the issues that you spoke about. We've still got the issues of, diligent enforcement. We've still got the issues of like how best to implement this, how best to not let it, revert back to what it was and all the rest of it. But step one is kind of undeniable. That's what kind of like this whole Nations of Sanity project is about. It's not saying this is the end of the journey. It's saying this is the beginning of the journey. This is the foundation you need for a sane society. And then on top of that, you could have a relatively crap society or you could have a really good society. There's no guarantee either way beyond that, but at least you've got your first step foundation of providing law in a way that's kind of undeniable. Crimes will still happen, but at least we're on the same page. It won't be like systemic like it is now, where our own governments are criminals, you know what I mean? And governments themselves wouldn't be able to exist as ruling authorities. They would have to exist as voluntary collectives. And the coercion that they currently exercise is one of the reasons why they're so corrupt and so incompetent, and all the things that are wrong with government come from the fact that we don't have any choice about paying our taxes and where our taxes go and who's ruling us and all the rest of it. Whereas in a system where the one thing that is established, everything else is up for debate, but the one thing that's kind of set in stone, if you like, is the basic idea that crime, law, rights and freedom, these simple concepts are all objectively definable by the underlying concept that every individual has right over only themselves.
I'm going to hop in and ask you a question, Matt, and then I'll have Phil hop in if he wants right after you answer the question. I want to I want to clarify something with maybe the contrast I see between you and Jeremy, even though you mostly agree. Let's scale it down to like this small island. There's like 100 people on the island, and there's endless amounts of food. And let's say everybody has the freedom to get whatever food they want, and there's no refrigerators, no freezers, none of this stuff. And so people, if they want food during wintertime, they have to be able to prepare the food they're gathering to work for wintertime. So let's say 70% of the people, they'll gather grains that they can dry out and store during winter, and they'll gather all these different things. And then 30% of the people, they just eat whatever they want to eat right then, but they don't plan ahead. And then winter shows up. And everybody had the freedom to do whatever they want, and we live in this society where everybody just has this freedom. There's no government like taking care of people. Even like I'm guessing Jeremy's stance with consequentialism would be that there should be some form of process the government would do to get these less intelligent people food. Whereas Matt, let me know if I'm correct here, that you might hope the smarter people with more food that realize they have even more than they need might donate their food. But in the very worst case scenario, if they don't want to, it's perfectly acceptable and not immoral to let those people essentially die of their own poor choices. Is that kind of accurate for this weird little scenario?
Yeah, I mean, the law allows for it. I mean, one of the ways I distinguish myself from anarcho-capitalists who kind of stand on the same principle as me, but I don't call myself an anarcho-capitalist, I like to call myself a voluntarist, because I don't like the connotations of the capitalist aspect of it. Because for me, I'm not one of these people that just trusts the free market and trusts charities or whatever. I do think we need systems where we look after the poor and the less fortunate. I just think we do that more effectively through voluntary systems. I think those systems there's enough of us that want that we would have that, even if we weren't being forced to. And yeah, there'd be plenty of people that would opt out and say, I don't want no part of that. I don't want you. There's plenty of right wingers who just be like, no, I don't want none of your commie stuff. You know what I mean? And all the rest of it. But the point of it is, I mean, if you look at how much tax money that we pay and how much is wasted on things that we don't even agree with, like some of the things that we even vehemently oppose, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that we would be able to have voluntary collectives that operate in the way that we want government to operate, but certainly more effective. Because if it became so bureaucratic and so corrupt as governments do, we would have the option of abandoning them. And it's like over here, we've got an NHS that's falling apart. And part of the reason for that is no matter how bad it gets, I don't have a choice about paying into it. And I want to pay into, I want to have an NHS. I want free at the point of use health care for everybody here. But I don't want to have no choice about the system that I'm paying into that's providing that. Because if that becomes so corrupt and broken, I don't have enough money to pay to something else because I'm being forced to pay into that. So I feel like there's enough people that not only could we take care of those needs, but I think those needs would be better taken care of because most of our money wouldn't get stolen and siphoned off into other things and all the rest of it. And we could actually have this sort of accountable collectives that we want our governments to be. But the reason they never are is because they don't have to be, because they rule us at the end of the day.
Okay.
Carson, sorry.
Jeremy.
If you two are having a back and forth, that's okay.
I just wanted to respond to Carson's island example and what he suggested about the consequentialist position being with the 30 people, like in the ants and the grasshopper fable, where the grasshopper played throughout the summer until the winter came. It sounds more than a bit like a caricature of consequentialism. To think that saying that morality is ultimately based upon consequences in terms of happiness and suffering is to have tunnel vision on only first order impacts, first order consequences, maybe there's some naive kind of child primitive version of the consequentialist intuition that starts that way, but any sophisticated consequentialist is going to understand that things like, if you make it known that people will be provided with food in the winter, whether or not they do anything to prepare food for the winter, then you're creating an incentive for people to do less work and and enjoy themselves more and participate less. So that's one example. Another example is consequentialists would realize that the people who did the majority of the preparation work and suffered in order to create this more important benefit when the winter came, they get angry, and so then you have this this likelihood of violence, or at least some kind of costly conflict, intergroup conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, well, just so you know, I didn't mean any insult in towards consequentialism.
No insult taken, no insult taken at all.
Well, just to give a quick,
I'm just clarifying the fact that consequentialism doesn't mean naive tunnel vision on first order consequences. If you only looked at the first order consequences, then sure, you would say, moral egalitarianism seems to be very obviously true. Somebody having enough food to not starve in the winter is a higher benefit than the people who did more of the work and already have enough to eat, getting to enjoy even more delicious food or something like that. The basic of avoiding starvation is a more significant consequence. So if you were tunnel vision focused on the first order consequence, then sure, you would say, just straightforwardly, you would support redistribution no matter how it came about. But you very quickly get to consideration of higher order consequences, and you realize what having such a bad incentive structure and creating interpersonal conflicts how that greatly changes the situation. And then the consequentialist focus, the mature consequentialist focus shifts to things like how do we most effectively incentivize all of the people to do the most productive necessary work, and then how do we minimize intergroup conflicts, and how do we build a sense of community to where people naturally sacrifice small amounts of their own interests to prepare for the future and maintain the stability of the society, and that ends up looking a lot more sophisticated than the simple redistribution calculation.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm going to bring Phil into this, and we can tie everything that was just said that you might want to respond to in with guns. So I'm just kind of curious if you think it'd be best if we had something the size of the U.S. and starting from scratch, trying to figure out, should there be certain laws connected to guns that the government should make for the entire country, and should there be certain ones that are left to 50 states or 100 states or 4 states? So yeah, just a quick rundown on how you might tie that in with what they said.
Well, let me first say it sounded at first like the non-aggression principle you get from a libertarian perspective. But as the conversation has gone on, I'm not sure I am clear on the vision that we're talking about. I normally struggle for radically new. Oh, by the way, I just want to reiterate that from a fundamental level, I agree with all of the premises that Jeremy laid forward, right, in terms of being a consequentialist, and I think what Jeremy might have been alluding to, because I don't want to put any words in his mouth, when he mentioned game theory, is that essentially you always have politics arising within humans, right? A struggle over, you could call it a struggle over power, or you could call it a kind of a game theory where you're discerning. I know one philosopher put it as like politics is the game of discerning friends from enemies, and it's all about a matter of fear and greed that play into account. And what that leads to eventually is you always have, at least in my opinion, government by some other name, right? It doesn't seem to me that it's very possible to have a society without government. You could have it for a limited time, and then it's created by politics between human beings. So that's how I see that in particular. When it comes to how that relates to firearms, I normally view firearms and free speech as analogous to each other, right? These are meta freedoms that are used to provide a self-check, where power, there's, your free speech is soft power and your firearms are hard power, and they help to distribute power throughout society. Now they're not a replacement for money, right? Because money buys speech, money buys guns, money buys power. But at least giving some sort of right that is as distributed as possible helps to prevent the worst excesses of the loser groups, right? I don't mean that as a disparagement. When groups compete with each other, there are winners and losers, and there's at least a chance for a more equitable society when those meta freedoms are not concentrated in the hands of the winners.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Phil, I think anarcho-capitalism can easily agree with your characterization of alliances and organizations forming that are, to quote you, government by another name. The difference would just be that these governments by another name under anarcho-capitalism would not be geographically defined monopolies.
mm-hmm.
They would be like many other of the essentials of our lives, subject to market competition and the laws of supply and demand, which generally work far better in the provision of many goods and services than these geographically defined monopolies appear to in the realm of self-defense and conflict resolution.
Yeah, well, I just want to hop in because as far as what you just said to Phil, and then when I listened back to what me and Matt talked about on that other talk, I agree with a lot of it. I agree with almost all of it. But the thing that I agree with Phil on, that you can have this for a little while, but eventually you're going to have a government, is like, let's say that we had this. Let's say we had this idea where there's basically no government. There's no centralized group that can go in and force these different things on each other. But let's say for a short while, we all agree with this principle of killing is wrong, raping is wrong, enslavement's wrong, all these different things. And then there's the things that we decide on as collectives is the gray areas. Well, the problem I think we're going to have is, if in the U.S. we got 50 states, even if we don't call them states, let's say all the people in Texas decide, you know what, I think we can do something better than this. We all agreed for a while, but I think we should actually have a government. And then they want to form a government. And then some people that think, oh, no, we really like it how it is, or like anarcho-capitalism, some people might say, oh no, we don't want these guys to take over and create a government that we don't want, and then they try to fight. But right now, not that I'm saying our system's great in the US or anything, but it might be. I don't know. But right now, if there's any issue, there's a central government that can send a military in to take care of some issue. But if there's nobody to do that, then I feel like there will always be groups trying to form to eventually gain that power. And so I think you'll, no matter what, have a power like that. And the question is, can a government be formed that has the power but gives itself checks and balances? Or do you have a government that is created through revolution and then having like a Napoleon type situation in France?
I think there are no checks and balances that can be built into a single monopolistic institution. As hard as our founding fathers tried, and the other countries' founders have tried, there could be no checks and balances in such a monopolistic system that could remotely compare to the checks and balances of market competition.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one thing where I again distinguish myself from anarcho-capitalism a little bit is I don't focus on the decentralization. So, like, that's not the issue for me. I don't need to split government up into lots of little ones. And I don't have a problem. I mean, there's a lot of arguments for what you're talking about with regards to having like a centralized system where, you know, you've got like a big law enforcement that's all working from the same page in regards to being a, you know, like the government in that sense. But the aspect of the government that I want to eradicate, and perhaps then in my mind, it's not really a government anymore. I mean, it's not important the name, and it's not important about it being centralized. It's important about whether it has ruling authority over people. Is like the whole idea of establishing like this non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement thing is basically saying, okay, these are our terms of peace, and then we go from there. So we can still have our, if people want to call them governments, I like to call them voluntary collectives, but for want of a better word, you can call them voluntary governments if you like. I mean, it's like, let's say I had my little Nations of Sanity revolution tomorrow because I had enough support or whatever, and let's say I just done it in England, for example. We overthrew the government. We don't have to burn everything down, tear up all the roads and all the rest of it. We can just carry on. We can still have a centralized system, but now it no longer has any kind of coercive power over anybody. It's as equally subservient to this peace agreement as everybody else. Because that's my issue, because a lot of people talk about, oh, well, perhaps we should have like local governments and stuff like that. And anyone who's dealt with their local authorities, councils and governments know that they're just as corrupt as the national ones. So that's not solving any kind of problem. And even like anarcho-capitalism, even though I work from the same principle of it, it still leaves open. I mean, I had a debate with David Friedman, who's quite a well-known anarcho-capitalist, about this issue, because basically he envisaged, or he defines anarcho-capitalism in a way that still allows for coercion. He basically said, and I don't think I'm misrepresenting him here, but I'm obviously, you know, he's not here to speak for himself. But basically, he said that anarcho-capitalism would probably lead to a libertarian society, but it doesn't have to. It would still be anarcho-capitalism if there was things like drug laws from some little mini court system, or slavery even. You know, he said he didn't think those things would happen, that they would be likely, but they would still be like allowable within the definition. And my side of the debate on that was, well, I thought that violated the anarchism part, because, you know, you're basically establishing yourself as a ruler when you're imposing things like drug laws and certainly slavery. So that violates the anarchism side, and even the capitalism side, even though it's not as explicit. And that's why I don't particularly like that definition of what I am and the principle in that. But even capitalism has that underlying principle of property rights, which itself comes from the concept of individual self-ownership. So I felt like it was a contradiction to have an anarcho-capitalist society that wasn't libertarian. It's like, is it still but like I say, but putting that to one side just for a moment, my point is it doesn't matter what you call it. The thing that needs to be emphasized above all else is how we define law, how we define rights, how we define like the rules, if you like. So we're all in this big game, and what do? How do we have our governments, if we want to call them governments or whatever? It's like, okay, but what are the rules we're working in? It's like if we had like an international treaty against slavery or rape or theft or murder or all these specific things, but instead of all these specific things, we have one concept and principle that tells us all these specific things as a kind of, objective truth based on that presupposition. You don't need to ask me if rape is illegal when the non-aggression principles of law, because you can work it out for yourself, because it violates that principle. So then, yes, it is. Is smoking cannabis legal? Well, does it violate that principle? No, it doesn't. There you go. So it answers the questions for you. And like I say, so I'm not like everything you're saying about, it would be good to have a centralized organization. I agree. It would also, like I say, I support, if you, for want of a better word, socialized healthcare, but not socialism with the coercion, just socialism in the aspect of, for want of a better word, voluntarism. Yeah, but it's not necessarily the traditional free market, profit business, all of that business. We can work together as collectives. We can have something that many would describe as socialism, if they didn't include the coercion into the definition of socialism. It's like voluntary socialism, if that's not an oxymoron.
Mm-hmm. Phil, did you want to hop in here? And I got to run for a sec, but I'll be right back in like 2 minutes. But yeah.
Oh, sure. Just a question I wanted to hop in with was that I suppose maybe I'm misconceptualizing the way I see coercion, because I don't see. I mean, you can see how a sexual interaction with coercion is great, right? A appropriation of property with coercion is robbery. So I can see how we sort of try to grapple to make these illegal, but coercion, there are many cases where there are simply things to argue over, things to have conflict over that are not straightforward and logical, like when two governments say, where's the line between our countries? Or, even if you don't have states, it's where's the line between our properties? And we, like you said, we have the court system to work that out. But at a more fundamental level, I see coercion as something that arises from conflict, right? It's a fundamental property of conflict. So am I not getting it? And I'm not trying to, this is not even a criticism, it's just a curiosity. Am I not getting how we're able to eliminate coercion? Because I don't see that.
It's just, sorry,
okay.
Go on.
This is something that comes up among libertarians. I piss off a lot of libertarian friends by being an ethical consequentialist and saying this, but I would go so far as to say that there is no coherent concept of coercion that is both logically consistent and doesn't produce really ridiculous judgments. The core cases, are that it's clearly good because it produces better consequences to take away freedom of action of a small child. But there is, in reality, no categorical distinction between the 4-year-old and the 40-year-old. There's a continuum that is usually associated with age, but it also, within a given age, it varies across individuals. The amount to which their own interests are served by giving them maximum freedom or by restricting a lot of their freedom. So the fact that there is no categorical distinction between the small child and the adult, and creating arbitrary age thresholds, it doesn't solve the problem. It just creates an indefensible threshold. Another example is in proportional retaliation. That's going to come up with our gun example. Simply saying that you're against coercion, that you're against taking away people's personal autonomy. It doesn't logically lead to anything about what level of retaliatory or defensive violence is appropriate for different kinds of offenses. And then the third example would be, by trying to create a concept of coercion that doesn't strongly tie itself to utilitarian or consequentialist considerations, it fails to mark very crucial distinctions between different. I like to use an expression, moral topology. It essentially means all the moral features are the same except for the scope of the effect, right? So, tapping somebody on the shoulder when they didn't tell you could, it violates their consent in exactly the same way. It has exactly the same moral topology as raping someone, sexually penetrating someone without their consent. Those are both equally non-consensual. But the difference in the magnitude, but despite having the same topology, the difference in consequences is enormous, and that's, to me, what obviously marks the extreme difference between those two kinds of acts. So this concept of trying to base everything on this concept of coercion and not having it sensitive to, predictable effects on well-being. It either forces you to make absurd positions, which some people bite the bullet, and some deontologists bite the bullet, and they're willing to say that kissing your sleeping spouse on the forehead, because it does not involve consent, it's morally equivalent to rape, which people have said to me, or saying that that either it's morally wrong to restrict the freedoms of 4-year-old children. that's one kind of ridiculous place you can go, or trying to pretend that some magical metaphysical change happens on someone's 18th birthday that transforms them from somebody who can have their freedoms taken away to somebody who should never have their freedoms taken away. That's also ridiculous. So again, I think, some concepts like coercion, or its opposite, consent, they're very useful heuristics much of the time, but we have to let them fade away when they no longer best capture the expected effects on maximizing well-being.
Would all of us agree that sometimes absurdities are acceptable, or maybe they are the lesser of two evils, in the case of having to have rules in the form of laws that are very clear? So, age of consent, for example. One day, you're a pederast if you engage in sex with a person, and the next day, it's perfectly legal. But the law having clarity, I mean, we could alternatively have a much more sliding scale for a law like that, but there are examples where simply having an arbitrary rule is perhaps problematic, but better than the alternatives, just because that way everybody knows the rules.
Phil, what I've been talking about previously is about morality. It's about the underlying moral principles. So I agree with you with respect to laws, which are, predefined rules that give people the expectation of punishment. What I object to is, thinking that the fundamental underlying morality works the same way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, but just as far as law goes, I definitely agree with Phil. But I think this is a case, and most cases, especially when it comes to something being affected by an arbitrary thing like adulthood, would have the gray zone, like Matt talks about, where you have this. There's nothing better that I can imagine than having an arbitrary date that makes you an adult. So it could be 17, could be 18, could be 19, could even be 20. And it's just this random thing that we decide on as a society. And then once that's official, then you have to have like kind of a gray zone. So if you say a 17-year-old sleeping with like a 60-year-old, is crazier than an 18-year-old sleeping with a 60-year-old if an 18-year-old is adulthood, then I think you have to kind of have this gray zone that we can recognize the 60-year-old and the 17-year-old, whatever we're calling wrong about that 60-year-old is not the same wrong thing as a 60-year-old and a 5-year-old. We have to have these separations with these zones of like, okay, this person's doing something that we deem is not acceptable arbitrarily, but it's based on the development of the human body. So these 16 and 17-year-olds that are hooking up with adults, we don't have to put them in the same category of don't let them go near playgrounds. And I think that's kind of where gray zones come in of different things. Kind of like if a 17-year-old murders somebody, it's going to be closer to the outcome of an adult murdering somebody than if an 8-year-old murders someone, and we can assume that with the right treatment, that 8-year-old can be better. I'll stop rambling, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just address, I mean, Phil's point with regards to sort of the defining coercion thing. I again, with everything, and I'll do this a lot with a lot of these answers, I always refer it to the underlying concept of individual self-ownership. So it's basically we're agreeing on that presupposition. You have right over you own you, and I own me, and we all have. It's like having we all understand whose car's whose. You know, we've all got different cars. The red one's yours, the pink one's mine, or whatever. You know, when we understand that reality. Because the thing is, and this is to address Jeremy's point as well, because I understand the continuum problem that you speak about, but in my opinion, the continuum doesn't destroy the distinction. And one of the examples I use on my Nations of Sanity project is I've got an article titled "Where the Desert Meets the Grassland." And it's basically describing how, you know, the desert and the grassland can be defined as two separate things, and they're quite distinguishable from each other. You know, the grass is obviously full of grass and the desert is full of sand. But geographically, you could walk from one to the other, and there's not a perfect line that you step over where one becomes the other. There's a kind of in-between area that's kind of hard to define. There's a bit of grass there, there's a bit of sand, and, you know, so... And the point I make is what we can apply the same thing to all of these issues with regards to here. We still got our principle that's nice and black and white, but what we have is these kind of this continuum problem where one morphs into the other, and there's not. And I don't think we should kid ourselves by going, oh well, this is too complicated, let's just put an arbitrary number on it, because we're giving up before we've finished the equation. It's like it's as objectively identifiable as 2 + 2, but it's a more complicated sum. It takes a little bit more, but we still have the answer based on the underlying concept. And the issue with the continuum thing, to go back to the metaphor of the desert meets the grassland, is what you can do is you can say, okay, well, there's a point where we draw a line. We can agree that there's this area in between that's a grey area, if you like, the fuzzy edges where reasonable people can disagree. And because we all have equal rights, no one can step in as an authority and say, well, okay, well, I'm dictating within this area. We'll have the sort of equal kind of say in that. But what we can do is draw a line where someone in this in-between area can sort of say, oh, I think this is still the grassland. And other people say, oh, I think this is still the desert. But what someone can't do is walk into the middle of the desert where it's purely desert now. There's no grassland, there's nothing. You're not in that grey area anymore. You're in the black and white. And when you're in that area, they can't declare they're in the grassland. They're now in the desert. And it's kind of like, so we draw those lines, what I call the limit of tolerance, where we're saying, okay, now you're definitely, and it's a little bit like what we already have now in our criminal justice system, where we have the beyond reasonable doubt standard with convicting someone of a crime. You have to convict them beyond a reasonable doubt. Preponderance of evidence isn't enough. Thinking they've done it's not enough. And the implication behind that is if you don't have that, you know, you can't be 100%, you know, nothing's 100% objective, but you can be, I know reasonable sort of screams subjective, but you know, you've got that aspect. But then what I'm saying is you still got the grey area to deal with. So, okay, well, that solves the black and white, but we still got this big grey area in between. Self-ownership answers that question as well, because every issue that you have, let's take the parent thing, okay, for example. You've got a child. The parent has got, I mean, again, this comes from self-ownership, but if I bring a child into this world, I have a duty of care over that child. It's a little bit like if I push someone into the water, I would be responsible if they drowned. Now, I don't have an obligation to rescue a drowning man under normal circumstances, but if I'm the one who caused them to fall into the water, whether it was accident or not, I put them in peril. I'm responsible for what happened. So I would have an obligation to rescue them from the drowning water. And a similar principle applies with my children. I brought them into the world, into peril, because they're not equipped to even understand it at first, let alone look after themselves. So I have a duty of care, a guardianship over them. Now, that guardianship doesn't make me a property owner or a ruler of them. It's, like I say, it's a duty of care, but it does give me a certain authority to decide how I exercise that duty of care. You know, so I have the authority over the grey areas. So it's like with, you know, if you can say I'm stepping over the line and child abuse, you can step in and take my child from me. But if it's a grey area, it's up to me because I'm the parent. And that would also apply with age of consent. So we can draw a line at one extreme and say, no, you're definitely an adult here. And if a parent's trying to hold on to their authority over their child, they're essentially enslaving a perfectly consenting adult who should be free to make their own decisions. But likewise, if they're trying to abandon like their 3-year-old or whatever and say, oh, he's an adult now, well, I don't need to look after him anymore. It's like, no, actually you do. Because, you know, it's not in that thingy. But in the grey area, where we're not sure, the only person that has a right to make that decision based on the underlying concept is the parent. So it would basically, you'd have your black and white, you'd have your definitely an adult past here and definitely a child below there, and in between, the parent decides.
It sounds as if you've been greatly misunderstanding me, hearing all of this talk. If you understood me to be, my point to be that the existence of gray areas somehow causes there to be a problem with making strong judgments in cases that are far away from the gray areas. That is nothing like what I was.
No, I wasn't saying that you were saying that. I just wanted to clarify what my solution to the continuum problem is.
Okay, this might be a distinction right here. This might be an actual distinction, but what I'm claiming is that the nature of the continuum, including the gray areas and the regions that are far away from the gray areas, it's based upon something else.
Exactly.
It's not based upon just kind of a arbitrary social convention or decree. It's based upon some other phenomenon, and what that phenomenon is consequentialist. The nature of the difference between the 4-year-old and the 40-year-old vis-a-vis the desirability of giving them maximum freedom is precisely that the 4-year-old's well-being is strongly facilitated by more competent guardians denying them their freedom. If the 4-year-old were to be given maximum freedom, they would almost certainly harm themselves and or others, whereas the 40-year-old given maximum freedom has the capacity to take care of themselves and advance their own interests in a way that is compatible with pro-social consideration of the others in society. It's the ramifications of giving degrees of freedom to the 4-year-old versus the 40-year-old that explains the nature of the continuum. It's analogous to the objective features about plant flora and fauna that define grasslands and deserts and the transitional states between them. The thing that's analogous is the predictable consequences of granting degrees of freedom on the well-being of the individual and the people they affect. That's what differs between small children and adults, and that is precisely what is transitional throughout older childhood and adolescence. It's the connection between freedom versus constraint on the one hand, and expected positive and negative utility for themselves and others that explains why we need to think about this transition, the nature of the extremes and the nature of the gray area.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would sort of push back a little bit on that, I think I'm understanding you correctly, but sorry, I've had a bit of a mind blank then, just as I was about to put a point.
What else could it be? why else would we want there to be a period in older childhood or adolescence where they should be given some freedoms but not other freedoms?
Oh, sorry,
other
yeah, that's
than
what I was
other
gonna-
than the
yeah.
fact that this basket of freedoms over here, if you were to give them to the average a 10-year-old, would probably allow them to flourish and not harm themselves and others, whereas this other basket over here, like letting them drink alcohol, is
I'm feeling
really
guilty
really
for this.
likely to cause harm.
Yeah,
feel
I understand what
What
you're
is
saying.
it
but
if
my-
it's not the
sorry.
likelihood of harm? What other factor would
Well,
characterize
I still
that gray area?
Well, I still think it's that underlying concept of individual self-ownership, because with the case of the child, it's not that you're denying their self-ownership or their freedom. It's basically you're making the determination that they can't exercise it because they don't have the mental competence. You know, it's like one of the reasons why we say a child can't consent is because they don't understand. You know, they can't. That's why they can't enter into legal contracts and stuff. Is that we don't view them to have the competency. You know, it's the same reason. I mean, in a way, I exert the same authority over my child as I do my dog, because they're not going to run out into the road. I'm not going to let them. You know what I mean? Because they don't understand. Now, I'm not violating their self-ownership. I'm acting with implicit consent because they can't make the decisions. It's a little bit like taking the keys off a drunk driver. It's like under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have the right to take your keys off you and say you can't drive somewhere. But if you're drunk, then I'm saying, okay, it's no longer really you. I mean, it is you in a sense, but you're no longer of sound mind. So you're no longer consenting. So I'm no longer violating your consent. And it's the same with the child. I'm not violating my child's consent because my child can't make consent. And I'm actually employing implicit consent to act on his behalf.
Could I jump in?
This is a textbook example of what I refer to as magic words. Matt is making up words, implicit consent, and not really violating consent. He's making up all of these additional like verbal distinctions in order to explain something that's directly explainable by consequences.
Well, hold on.
Well,
Hold
no,
on.
if I could
Hold
defend
on.
that.
Well,
Okay.
really quick. Yes, you can in a sec. I want Phil to hop in here first, but I just want to point out I might not have slept much last night. I don't feel like you guys disagree on anything, yet you strongly disagree. So I'm confused. But Phil,
There's not a lot of disagreement here. It's very
the reason why it's
fine
ordinarily
detail
wrong
stuff.
to take someone's keys and prevent them from driving, and it's not wrong.
Wait,
when
Jeremy,
they're
hold
gonna
on,
drive
hold
home
on.
Drunk is because
Jeremy-
in the latter case, it's gonna be very likely to cause harm to themselves and others.
I don't think Phil, you
So-
hop in first.
Okay, so let's do our landscape not landscape, but let's do our biome analogy, where you have the desert of ignorance, where people are not capable of making good decisions, and you have the flourishing and verdant valley of wisdom, where people can make their own good decisions. If someone's drinking, right, then they're moving in from one biome to the other, right? They're moving from a more competent and verdant biome to a more desolate biome. And I would agree with Jeremy about the fundamental reason of why that matters, right? Here's how I would say it. There's this hypothetical position, this hypothetical decision-making center that makes the perfect decision. None of us actually have access to that. But our best way of sort of conceptualizing how to reach that perfect decision-making box is that the people in the verdant valley of wisdom, they can be left to their own devices. They're the adults who are, I don't want to get too controversial, but they have whatever features we want from good decision-making people. And then you have people who are less capable of making those decisions, and they are less able to find their way. And I like when you talk about someone who's drunk, it seems to fit right in with Jeremy's analogy of that biome. And I think that it's just that you're not either seeing or just not agreeing. I don't want to say you're not seeing, but you're not agreeing with the same sort of fundamental reason that it makes sense that we deny someone
their own right to make their own decisions is because they might make decisions that lead to negative consequences, and
because
I would even consider, can I add one more thing? I realize I'm randoming a little bit.
Yeah.
And that is what we're trying to do is, what's the probability that someone is going to make a good or bad decision? And if we want to maximize the probability of them of having a good outcome for them, the more they're into that desolate area, the more likely we have to make decisions for them. And that includes the drunk driver, that includes children, and so forth.
All right, Matt, go ahead and you can respond to Phil if you want, but you could defend yourself from what you wanted to say earlier when I cut you off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to defend the implicit consent just to give a more clear example of what I'm referring to with that is like, say, for example, you see someone's about to get hit by a bus. So you run out and you push them out of the way so they don't get killed by the bus. Now, you don't know 100% that they weren't intentionally standing in front of the bus because they had a deal with the bus driver that he was going to do an assisted suicide or something, But it's reasonable to assume that you would be acting with their implicit consent. You don't have time to get explicit consent. You don't have time to say, excuse me, is it okay if I save your life right now? So you have to act with implicit consent. That's what, just want to defend that point about making up words. I do have a genuine point behind those. There is a distinction there. Like, implicit consent is where it's like, okay, this person would, I think it's reasonable to assume, want me to push him out of the way of the bus. And my child would, I assume, want me to raise him responsibly until he has the mental competency to make his own decisions. Like these things are reasonable. So, and you can only invoke implicit consent when explicit consent is impossible. So like with the bus example, there wasn't time. Like with my child, I mean, some people even say to me that even having a child is a violation because you didn't get their consent to bring them into the world. And it's like, well, again, I'm invoking implicit consent on that.
That explains the person in front of the bus, that explicit consent is impossible. But that doesn't seem to explain the the would-be drunk driver, and it doesn't seem to explain the 4-year-old who says, I want to go outside.
It does explain kissing your wife on the forehead, though. It does.
It does. Sorry, what say again?
It's the thing that readily ties the person standing in front of the bus, the friend who wants to like stagger home drunk alongside a busy street, and the 4-year-old child who says, I don't care, I want to go outside and play now at midnight. The thing that ties all of those things together is reasonable expectation that you will be increasing the well-being of both that individual and the other people that they'll affect. That seems to be straightforwardly tying them together, and then when you create this concept of implicit consent, and you very well, you attempted to avoid reducing it to expectation of consequences by saying that the key issue was, or one key issue was, whether explicit consent was possible. And I agree, it doesn't seem to be possible in the case of the person standing in front of the bus, but it seems to be possible in the case of the drunk friend. He's telling you, no, I'm going to walk home. That's what I want to do. He's explicitly denying consent, and so is the 4-year-old when they're telling you they want to go out and play.
Yeah, but you're not recognizing their ability to give consent. That's what I'm saying. They're not of sound mind. They're basically out of it. And you're saying that if they were sober, they would like, oh, I'm so glad I didn't know what I was doing, kind of thing. That the point is, it's like you're almost saying they're not them at that point, not fully. They can't. So you're not.
I want to break.
I want to break. Convenient, convoluted way to explain the exact same judgments that are straightforwardly explained by consequentialism.
I want to break a couple of these things down real quick.
Sorry, can I just say one quick thing?
Go for it.
Sorry, because the reason why, Carson, the reason why, from your point of view, we seem to be agreeing a lot and disagreeing a lot is because we're agreeing on the correct courses of actions, but we're disagreeing on the reason why.
Yeah.
But the thing is I'm not disagreeing with your assertion, Jeremy, that the consequentialist argument that you make also works. Like, I'm not saying that that's not true, and that wouldn't be a perfectly valid reason to do all of these things. You could say, look, and this is my consequentialist reasons, and that would be fine. But my point is the underlying principle that I'm working from is underneath that all the time. And my only issue with the consequentialism thing is I don't want the underlying concept to be violated in the name of consequentialism. It's like the consequentialism may be true. Like the thing is what's like the Napper's law, as you say, probably is like consequentially a good thing to do, but that's not my reason. My reason is like the moral truth and the internal consistency and all the rest of it. Like that's the kind of the reason. And but I also agree with the consequentialism thing. So it's like I don't say that. I'm not saying that you're wrong when you say this is my consequentialist argument for the keys and for the child and all the rest of it, because it would be better if it wasn't. But I'm saying that you could create a consequentialist scenario where you could probably make an argument for why it'd be better to actually violate my rights. Like the examples I'm saying, these examples we've gone through don't violate anybody's rights, because I'm saying the child can't consent, the drunk person can't consent, and the person in front of the bus can't consent. I know you see them as different, but what I'm saying is they're essentially the same, because none of those times do you have that person of sound mind and body giving their consent. It's a drunk version of them, or it's a young version of them, or something like that.
Well, hold on. Let me share a thought, just because it might share some. Matt's gone. I'm gonna let Matt hop back in here before I give this thought.
Okay.
I'm sure he'll be in here in just a sec, and then we'll probably have to hop over to talking about guns in a second. But I think I disagree with both of you on the why, and I agree with both of you on the what to do about it. And so I'm curious to see if these thoughts make any sense. Where is he?
Oh, that's too bad.
As we're waiting for him, I'll just mention that I actually agree with implicit consent in some cases. I mean, I don't agree with the underlying value, the almost deontological value, that's what we care about, but that we use implicit consent as instrumental to finding good outcomes. For example, kissing your wife on the forehead, treating someone who's been hit by a car, treating them without their consent, of course. I'm not convinced that there's explicit consent to have a child, that child in the future. I don't know if there's explicit consent across time in that way. But maybe there is. I could be convinced of that.
I mean, so there are certain things that I could reasonably describe as implicit consent, and it would be something like something that ordinarily you need explicit consent for. Like your neighbor has said, "Hey man, you can feel free to use my shovel anytime. Feel free to use my rake anytime," and then you like some other tool that's in the same area, like a trowel, gardening trowel, and then you just go over and use the trowel for a few minutes. That's the kind of thing that it makes sense to call implicit consent, something you need explicit consent for, but it's just kind of obviously like logically close to the same sort of action that you were given explicit consent for. That kind of thing makes sense. But when it's kissing your sleeping spouse on the forehead and there was no conversation, just like most people would never have a conversation beforehand about whether or not they would consent to something like that, it's just widely regarded as a normally good thing or okay thing to do in a relationship, and it's because it doesn't cause any negative consequences for the vast majority of people. That's a better straightforward explanation. I want to say, what Matt said before he dropped off, the way it seems to me is that you are willing to violate a very straightforward, clearly defined concept of consent in many circumstances. And then what you do is you make up linguistic, this is why I use the term magic words a lot. You make up these further linguistic distinctions to act like you're not violating the straightforward concept, but you are violating it. And so in the circumstances that you imagine where an ethical consequentialist would think that it was good to violate someone's rights, well, if they were acting like the deontologists, if they were acting in fact, like the same way that I think you act with the drunk friend and the small child and so forth, they could just make up a linguistic distinction, and they could say, well, I'm not actually violating your right by prohibiting you from purchasing tobacco products because that tobacco makes you not fully yourself, so it's blah blah blah. It's consent asterisk star prime symbol, and so I am fully respecting your consent. I'm just respecting the free from nicotine addiction Matt's implicit consent. Anybody could do anybody. I don't see what the constraining factor on making up more magic words to act as if you're not violating your principle is. If it's not, to the consequentialist, what happiness and suffering are is a pretty clear foundation, and it seems to ground all of the exceptions that people are making in practice. And so why would it be a violation by the ethical consequentialist? We could just make up the same kind of magic words that you make up to act as if taking the keys away from your drunk friend is respecting his freedom and not violating his consent.
Okay, well let's get to the answer of this as quick as possible so we can get to the gun talk. I had a thing I was going to say on some of the earlier talk, but I'll save that for a different time. But real quick, I feel like there must be an arbitrary line that has to exist. For example, if you have a 3-month-old and then you set it down, you don't kill it, but you don't feed it. It's going to die. So we have to accept that there must be some difference between letting that 3-month-old figure out what it's going to do, and then if it dies, it's nobody's fault. There has to be elements of neglect. And so obviously that's not going to happen at 3 months, 4 months. And somebody could even argue to let 8-year-olds start going off on their own and being adults. But that's probably a bad idea. So we have to have an arbitrary line. Does it matter if we call it implicit consent or not? Wouldn't it just be that we, no matter what, have to have an arbitrary line, and anything before that is just a human that has not reached an age of what the society says gives you your own rights over yourself?
I think predictions about consequences explain it all. They explain it all. They explain why okay.
But no, they really shouldn't though. Well, hold on. Let me say a quick thing to that, because I think we can have obvious things that we can't do. We can't stab 5-year-olds. And we can have obvious things about harm, but we cannot. I don't think we should legally force a parent's parenting choices to be based on consequentialism. If that's what you're saying,
what explains why it's morally a good idea to not allow a 1-year-old to stand up and walk around the house freely, and so we put these baby guards. We put them in their playpen with walls, or we wall off certain sections of the house. But an 8-year-old, it's normally it's pretty fine if they want to get up out of the chair and stroll around the house. They can do it, but it's not okay if the 8-year-old wants to go play outside alone at night. The difference is that the 8-year-old is not very likely to harm themselves walking around the house and standing up out of their chair, where their 1-year-old is, and the 8-year-old is likely to harm themselves playing in the street at night.
Yeah, you just
that is also true. That is also true. But I have to come back to this implicit consent thing, because I know you call it a magic word and all that, but you do accept it, correct me if I'm wrong, with the example of the pushing someone out of the bus way.
So how does it explain the 1-year-old and walling off sections of the house or confining them to their playpen? Is it
just to establish
you're not violating their implicit consent if they were able to think like an older child? Then they would.
I have an answer to that.
I would not like to get hurt.
If they were able to think like an older child, they're not, though. That's the point. That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying the implicit. Like, my point is like, I know you're saying implicit consent's not a thing, but you're accepting it in the example of the bus thing. So I think we can establish that there is such a thing as implicit consent. You're just saying it doesn't apply to the baby or the
For
child.
children, yeah. Well, let's
Well,
let
I'm
Bill
saying-
respond
I'm
real
saying-
quick,
I'm
and then I
saying
have a
makes
question
more-
for Matt.
It makes more sense in that example to use those terms.
Okay.
But
I
but
do
the
have an
underlying
answer to your
principle
question,
of the guy in front of the bus is still that you're expecting to greatly increase his well-being by pushing him out of the way of the bus.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
but I'm
hold
not saying that your consequent. Sorry,
Hold
can I
on.
just quickly say? I'm not saying that your consequentialist argument isn't also true. I'm not saying like you can't make that consequential argument in the bus thing as well. But what I'm saying is you can also use implicit consent in that scenario. Do you accept that implicit consent? Like, are you saying that I'm violating that person's rights when I push him out the way of the bus, or are you saying it's reasonable to assume that I have his implicit consent and I'm unable to get his explicit consent?
I think
Yeah.
Matt, that the only thing that words like right and rights and consent and freedom can possibly consistently and coherently mean is grounded in considerations of expected well-being.
Yeah, well, hold on.
I have
Hold on.
an
Hold
answer to
on.
Jeremy's question.
Yeah.
And that is that how can you explain with implicit consent why we put the baby gate up, right? How do you have the implicit consent of the baby, of the 1-year-old, and you don't of that 1-year-old at the present moment, right? But we can use the term implicit consent across time and ask ourselves, what is our best guess of what the future adult self of that 1-year-old would want us to do? Do we have the implicit consent rather of that adult 17, 20, 30 years from now to use that baby gate? And another way of saying that is we're doing it for their own good, right? Really for their own good.
Yeah.
Well, the first way you said it was basically how I'm saying it, and the other way you said it is how Jeremy's saying it. So I know what you're saying. We're saying the same thing, but from a different kind of
because
angle.
pushing somebody out of the way of the bus is removing their freedom. That we all have the freedom to do anything we can do, and as soon as you prevent that, you're removing freedom. So the freedom that person had to get hit by the bus unknowingly, you pushing them remove that. They don't have that freedom anymore, and you're doing it with implicit consent, and you're also doing it for the consequences that would be best for that person. So it does both of those things while removing freedoms. The reason I think you guys are possibly, in a sense, all wrong about the children, at least if we're looking at it from a legal standpoint or rules or laws, is that what you guys are talking about is what a good parent might want to do. They might want to make these choices for their kids with implicit consent. They might want to do it for the consequences. But when it comes to the law, I think we just have to have, like Jeremy, you've talked about how it's immoral to take your children to church and brainwash them. Now you could think the consequences are bad, but the person doing it might think the consequences are good, and somebody might think with implicit consent that clearly this kid older would want this. But what if this kid isn't going to be that religion older? So you might have the implicit consent idea wrong. So really, what it comes down to is you have a list of things that with this age that is before this arbitrary adult age you cannot do. And everything else in the gray zone is up to the parents. And implicit consent or consequentialism doesn't explain any of it, because one parent might put their kid in some baby gate thing and ignore their kid all day. As long as they're fed, they're fine. And another parent might hang out with their kid and give them all the love, maybe too much love. One parent might want to make their kid learn 10 different languages by the time they're 5 so they can be the smartest kid ever, but it's going to have some other negative effects. These things should be legal in my mind, and therefore the implicit consent is just an individual personal want, and same thing with the consequentialism.
Carson, I think the implication that I draw from your examples of harm that would be caused by combining consequentialist ethics with very extremely wrong views about the world is that consequentialism entails and includes a moral judgment of epistemological standards. You know, having your belief formation be reality tracking, at least to a large extent, maybe not in every single way, but to a large degree, it carries an inherent moral judgment to it. You know, if you were to believe that that morally you should be maximizing consequences, and then you also believed in, you know, the literal hell as described in, you know, certain many versions of Christianity and Islam, and you believed factually that the creator would send people to eternal hellfire if they were engaging in homosexual acts, then you'd be willing to do almost anything to protect people you cared about, or just people in general from engaging in homosexual acts. You know, you'd be willing to threaten them with prison, you'd be willing to torture them, whatever. And because eternal hellfire is worse than whatever suffering was going to be inflicted on them. And what that means is that since, you know, there's no good reason to believe in it, that hell exists, or that there's a creator who judges people for those kind of acts. Those are very irrational things to believe in. And because if somebody believed them, ethical consequentialism would dictate that they do horrible things. That means that having the epistemological standards that give you those incredibly false beliefs in the first place is itself immoral. It's immoral to not have principles of
does any of this have anything to do with law
that track reality?
Okay.
Because of the negative consequences that could result from combining them with.
Does any of this have to do with
isn't
law?
that a problem with consequentialism, though, isn't it? Though, because it's like, you know, in theory, you could support slavery and all kinds of things that would be like obviously violation of the self-ownership that I wouldn't support.
I don't think that's a problem. I think if the facts about the adults of African origin who were enslaved in the U.S. were different, if the actual fact of reality were that they had the mental capacity and the expected behavior of 4-year-old children, then the morally correct treatment of them would be radically different. You know, the reason why slavery abolition and full rights for those people made sense is, of course, dependent on the facts of reality about their
okay, but all right, but what if someone came
equal
to you
capacities as adult humans?
I mean, I just want to jump in.
Someone came to you with some data. Sorry.
If they
did have
the capacity of 4-year-olds, then we should have treated them very differently.
Wait, Jeremy, let's let Phil hop in and Matt real quick.
It's like I'm the favorite student. I'm sorry.
Whoever talks the least, I let them hop in the most.
Okay, I see. Well, I just wanted to mention that, like, I just want you to notice, Matt, that what you're saying is consequentialism has this negative effect. What you're really arguing for is a deeper appreciation for the consequences. You know what I mean? Whenever you would make that point, it's not like, oh, well, this leads us to, you know, this repugnant conclusion. Well, yeah, like the best, most well-informed form of consequentialism takes into account the next deeper layer of consequences, that we don't want to achieve this negative outcome because of the way people perceive it. You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I mean, the way I kind of see it is like, put it this way, it's like, because the thing is, me and Jeremy obviously agree on a lot of things, but like I say, for the slightly different reason. But my problem with the consequentialism as being the reason, it's not like I don't also agree that it also works in the things that I'm advocating for as well. And it puts me and Jeremy on the same page on a lot of issues, but again, for different reasons. But the problem is like, if someone came to you with data that say free Africans are less happy than the slave. They came to you with some kind of data where they basically were able to establish, you know what, they're actually happier people, and not just Africans, people. You know, they've been able to establish that, you know, for whatever reason, because of our human flaws, when we're free, we're actually not as happy. And what I'm saying is the consequentialist would be potentially persuaded to support slavery or fascism or all these things because they were convinced of the consequence. You know, even the examples you gave of like the people that've got these, you know, religious beliefs of like, well, they actually think they're doing them a favor, like when the Muslims are killing the gays because they think they're saving them from a worse fate and all the rest of it. That is the problem with consequentialism. And my point is if I'm saying is like, what I'm saying is like, so you might support the Nations of Sanity project, for example, because you would see it consequentially as a good thing, and you think it would have good things. But then you might, for whatever reason, think actually no. And some fascist might convince you that actually no, he can create a system where people, even though they don't have their freedoms, and even though we might do this or the other, generally across the board, it's like by every metric of measurement, they can convince you that people are actually happier and better off and all the rest of it. My issue, what I'm saying is because of our differing points of view, you would leave the Nations of Sanity project and turn against it and support this fascist movement. I would stay there, even if you convince me of that data, even if you convince me that, yes, people are happier enslaved, people are happier without their freedom and, you know, without their individual self-ownership. I would still be like, do you know what? Okay, the moral truth, the underlying thing is, you know, it's still the moral truth is that we all have right over ourselves. If we have right over anything, it has to start with ourselves. Otherwise, the whole concept of morality becomes incoherent and you have to abandon it. So that's my only issue. Like I said, we do agree on lots of things, but because it's for that slightly different reason, that's my reason why I don't go, even though I agree that the consequentialist argument does work for a lot of these things, because it is also valid under that argument. But my point is I can think of examples where someone might be convinced that it's not. And then all of a sudden they're supporting fascism or slavery because they genuinely believe. You know,
Well,
even Hitler probably believed that he was working for a greater good, consequentially. You know what I mean?
The falsehood of the beliefs that were crucial to those people making the decisions that they did were themselves extremely immoral. It was immoral to have a process of belief formation that led to those false beliefs. Let me give you some analogies to just try to explain how this whole family of objections to consequentialism, which of course I'm very familiar
I'm going to pause
with.
you real quick, Jeremy. You should do this. I'm going to leave it up to you guys. We could continue along talking about what you guys are talking about and not talk about guns at all. Or you guys, Jeremy, you could say what you're going to say to kind of wrap up this idea, and then we can start talking about guns.
I think the second might be more useful.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead and say your thoughts to Matt, and then yeah.
For the record,
I
I'm
want
happy to have this conversation further if you want. I like having these discussions and being challenged. So,
And I do have one more point in this conversation after Jeremy and after Matt, and then I'm done.
Cool.
So, the problem with this whole family of objections to consequentialism is that I think our intuitions are not truly capable of getting over the very obvious fact that enslavement of adult humans causes tremendous net suffering. And so, when you say, well, what if the freed people had much more net suffering, lower net happiness or whatever than the enslaved people, you're relying on the very strong and true intuition, the fact that slavery produces much greater suffering, in order to make the conclusion seem absurd. When the consequentialist is saying what I think is the true answer, that yes, enslavement would be better than freedom if enslavement produced greater net well-being. The reason that sounds absurd is precisely because our intuitions can't escape the true increased suffering that's caused by slavery. So I want to give these analogies to other domains. So I wanted to just simplify it. And what if I said, okay, hypothetically, shit tastes better than strawberries? Then, like, a lot better. What if shit tasted really good and strawberries tasted terrible? In that case, which dessert would be preferable? Strawberry shortcake or shit shortcake?
I'm going to use this from now on.
Okay, if that was true, then shit shortcake would be a much better dessert than strawberry shortcake. Because you set up the terms. And so then you're going to turn around and say to the person who says, well, under that counterfactual, under that hypothetical, I guess I would strongly prefer the shit shortcake. You're going to say, what? Look at this guy. Look at this guy saying he likes shit shortcake. Well, no, you set up the very counterfactual idea that in general, shit tastes great and strawberries taste terrible. That's what you're doing when you try to present to a consequentialist.
Let me.
Imagine you had a law that was compelling you which one you had to eat, though. That's my problem.
Yeah,
like,
I feel so.
Okay.
I feel so strong on Matt's side here that I want to argue this for him, even if he doesn't want me to. If I'm understanding Matt's point correctly, which is it wouldn't matter if it was better or worse outcome for the slave, it's best to end slavery. Same thing would happen where if I went around killing all the worst humans, it might be a better outcome for all of society, but the law shouldn't let me do it. Even if I went out right now and did a Batman style thing and we could figure out that all 100 people I killed were some of the worst, scummiest drug dealers, pimps, all these different things that I don't know why those people are bad, that I don't have anything against drugs or prostitution. But anyways, let's just say the worst people that like kind of slap their wives around and stuff. And I just go kill them. It might have a good outcome, but I shouldn't be legally allowed to. And that's not just me setting up if you kill the worst people, is it good to kill the worst people? So maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but would you agree with that? And am I doing the same thing Matt did?
Well, I think the political objections to killing people who are doing very negative things on balance, and could even apply that to meat eaters, to non-vegans, definitely to people who are in the animal ag industry. The political reasons and the moral reasons to not use violence have to do with second and higher order consequences. Not that there's some special kind of morality that dictates that killing them and stopping the mass harm that they're inflicting is wrong, but that there are higher order consequences about what happens when violence is introduced into society, and there's retaliatory violence and leading to open warfare. It's those higher order consequentialist considerations that explain what the issues that you just brought up, Carson.
Phil, did you have a thought on that?
Well, actually, Jeremy had a better analogy. What I was going to say is, what if we lived in a world where every time you stole something from someone, it actually increased their happiness because they felt like, oh, it's a mystery, and everybody just loved that sensation, that feeling. So then everybody would start stealing from each other. Would you steal from people? Like, would you participate in that celebration of stealing from everyone? And it's sort of like setting up like a crazy, because the answer is yes, I'd steal all the time. But like, but that would be the answer if you honestly participate in the hypothetical, right? But it's such a wild hypothetical that an audience, by the way, is very likely to misunderstand.
Yeah, well, but it also depends on so many factors. Would every person that's stole from enjoy it? Would it have an overall outcome that? I guess I'd have to understand it in a different, better way, I guess. Because I can come up with examples of why slavery would be great and why situations where we might need it. But it doesn't mean that the overall hope would be to have something like freedom. Even if somebody doesn't want freedom for themselves, they can design some fake non-freedom within a world of freedom.
And I think the underlying moral truth that I like kind of put my little flag into is that you don't have the right to enslave them. So it's like the discussion of what would be best is irrelevant in my mind because it's not within the realms of what you have the right to do. So unless I'm making the conscious decision that I'm abandoning morality or I'm knowingly violating a morality that I accept, so I'm saying I admit this, I realize this is a crime and wrong, but I'm just going to do it anyway. It's like it gives you nowhere to go. It's like that. That's why I prefer it again to the concept. Because the thing is like I say, it's like, I don't think that it's very likely that a fascist or a slave trade wannabe or whatever is going to convince you to like abandon me on my Nations of Sanity project and go against me or whatever, or because you've been convinced that that's the better way. From a consequentialist point of view, you see freedom as a good thing, and self-ownership is a good thing, all the rest of it.
It's very
you might have quibbles
convenient.
on that, but my point, let's assume. Okay.
It's very convenient that you support the denial of the vast majority of freedom to precisely those people who are obviously benefited by having their freedom denied, namely small children. How convenient.
Well, yeah.
How convenient that your exception to your term happens to match up precisely to the real situations in which enslaving a given human increases their well-being. The small children.
Well, I mean, I think
the severely mentally disabled.
I think we'll need to continue this discussion, like, again, because I don't want to divert it. But the only thing I'll say to that is, from my point of view, whether you agree or not, the fact of the matter is I don't see that child as able to consent. So I'm not violating their consent. I'm not violating the drunk person's explicit consent because they're not able to give it. Just like the person who's about to get hit by the bus, he's not able to give it because there's not time to give it. The drunk person's not able to give it because he's not of sound mind to give it. The child's not able to give it because they're not of mental competency to give it. That's why I wouldn't accept a legal contract from a child, and that's why you can't have sex with them. It would be rape. It's all these things we already understand. But I mean, like I say, you don't have to agree, but what I'm saying is that's my standard. I'm not willing to violate people's rights. I'm willing to employ implicit consent for people who aren't yet able to exercise certain freedoms or consent to things they can't understand.
And I'm willing to make a sociological prediction that if there ever were a different group of people whose net well-being was substantially increased by having their freedoms taken away, then your lot would easily be able to make up new magic words to explain why taking away their freedoms in a certain respect didn't count as violating their consent as well.
There's no well-being. We'll have separate conversations on this. We'll have separate conversations on this in the future. But I'm just I'm gonna steal the last word and just remind you that there's no well-being involved. You own your children; they are your property, and you legally can't do certain things to them. But you can act without their well-being and be perfectly fine. If you don't agree, then it will be a complicated world. Like, there is no system that could set that up aside from living out in the wild and hoping to survive, where you can force well-being upon your property that we call children.
I disagree. But I'm willing to move on to the whole.
Okay.
I'm willing to move on to the gun and police thing.
Yeah.
Can I just say I do disagree that our children are our property. Like I say, I think our rights of authority over them aren't a property-based one of owning them. It's because we have a duty of care as their guardians, and that guardianship that actually provides us more of an obligation than it does like an authority, but it does also include a certain authority to, like I say, dictate how we honor our duty of care. So that's all I would say is I do differ. I don't say that our children are our property, and that's why from my point of view, we're not violating their rights. We're actually fulfilling our duty to rescue them from the water they can't swim in.
Yeah, and property is a bad word, and I'm only going to respond to this because we're waiting on Jeremy, then I'll hop to the guns. Yeah. But property is a bad word, but why I use that is we have a handful of things we can't do, and other people can't do to them. If somebody else stabs our child, it's not like they're in trouble because they damaged our property. And if we stab our own child, we're in trouble because we have these handful of things where we would consider like physical violence to a child bad, and a couple things here and there, maybe even risky things like a driving in a car without proper car seat or something like that. But those things are going to add up to like a small percentage of actions to children. The rest of them, the 95% of actions that only the guardians can do to the children. We can say what other humans cannot do to our children, but we can tell them, you can never eat a cookie for your entire childhood. You can never stay up past this time, or you can stay up till 3 a.m. every single night and have this horrible health because you're not getting good sleep. We can do whatever we want that doesn't fall into that specific black and white area.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm using property loosely. But almost anything that I think we all probably agree we should be allowed to do, it's like it's more than 95% of the actions, and only the guardians can do it, as if it's property that has a couple things we aren't allowed to do. But this will be worth breaking down in the future time.
Yeah.
I like this light on Jeremy's headphones. That it's dark and then just boom. It's like there's a little demon. Ooh, there's some more lights. Okay, so we're gonna hop on to guns now. Do you guys remember the two videos well enough to discuss them without watching them again, or should we watch them here?
I do, but if maybe for the audience, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we have an audience. Probably not.
What do you think, Matt?
Well, I have to confess I didn't actually manage to watch them.
Oh, you're fine.
So-
Let's just watch it right here then. No, you're fine. Let's see what happens when I go to... I got one kind of set up here. This one's only 3 minutes if I skip past the 911 calls. And then I'm going to go share screen, Phoenix shooting, share. Okay, got that up. There it is. They go there. One day I'll be better at this kind of thing. I need two monitors. Okay, that's basically the whole thing. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna hit play on this.
He's still in the parking lot. Is he by himself?
Yeah. He's got a hat on. Yeah. He's
Okay, so Matt, since you have not seen this before, the only part I'm skipping these first 2 minutes is just a bunch of 911 calls about a guy maybe with a rock breaking windows.
himself.
Right.
He's got a beard.
Hey, drop the rock, man! Drop the rock! Hey, Phoenix Police, drop the rock! I'm gonna take it. Drop the rock, buddy! Drop the rock! Drop the rock, then! Drop the rock!
Get back! Hey, get back here!
Hey, I get it! Drop the rock!
Drop the rock!
Drop it! Drop the rock!
Hey, let's get the stun bag out. 221 India. We're in it. Stun bag out here. He's got a rock.
The man was further than the effective distance of the taser, so the same officer retrieved a stun bag, an alternative, less lethal option. The man responded by running from the area on foot.
It's not loaded. Run northwest. Drop it! Drop it! Drop the rock!
The officer ordered the man to drop the rock, but the man again did not
Stun
comply.
bag. Get that stun bag up. Drop the rock and get down on the ground.
The officer called for a stun bag again, but the man ran away before the stun bag could be used. The officer continued to order the man to stop and drop the rock. The man did not. The officer again asked a backup officer for the stun bag. The man temporarily went out of view behind the restaurant, but then reappeared in the restaurant's outdoor patio. The man then lifted the rock in what appears to be a throwing motion and continued to move towards the restaurant's side door.
Drop the rock!
The officer again asked a backup officer for the stun bag.
Stun bag on the south side of this. Now! Do not go in there! 223, 221 Indian, 998. At the suspect's down. I don't know if there's anybody inside who needs help.
The man fell inside the restaurant, and officers moved in to detain him and render aid.
We need to see if anybody needs help in there, man. He's right behind that door. So I want you right here.
After the shooting, officers attempted to restrain the man as he continued to pull his arm away and kick the officers.
Let me see your hands, man. We're trying to help you.
No.
Get that arm back.
Help. Oh. Your hands behind your back. Stop resisting.
There you go. Get in there. Rotate.
The officers were able to secure the man and provide aid to include putting on a tourniquet. No other citizens or officers were injured during this incident.
All right. I'm glad we rewatched that because I actually thought the guy died from my memory of it. Okay, so let's go with Matt. So if this happened in our society and we're choosing if we think something is or is not a proper way to approach suspects and how police act, what are your thoughts on what we just saw?
It's a difficult one. I think he was shot.
Yeah.
Like because they said about having a stun thingy, but he was shot with an actual gun, I guess.
Yeah, I think I missed it. I don't know if either of you other guys heard it, but I think maybe they tried to get the stun bag or whatever gun shooter thing, but it either wasn't loaded or it was faulty, so they weren't able to shoot it.
I'll tell you, the only thing that makes it difficult for me is from the video, when he was going towards the restaurant, he seemed to be saying help as if he was asking them for help. And like let's put it this way, if the restaurant people didn't want him in there and he was going in uninvited and he was shot, I would think it's a pretty easy sort of decision in the sense of saying they had the right to do that. You have a right to shoot a home invader, and it would be a restaurant that would be the same as well. Like, you can defend your property in that sense because you're also defending your persons. You don't know what they're doing and all the rest of it. And again, this is something that maybe would need to be looked at. I'm not like the judge and stuff, but there's certainly a possibility there that what they done was beyond what was necessary in regards to the fact that, I don't know. I mean, but then again, he had a role. I mean, I'd need to know more, but they potentially did wrong. Although it's not it depends on certain details that you could potentially tell me about it. It's very, it's very close because they certainly had a right to pursue him if had he already smashed a window as well? Was that true?
He smashed a bunch of windows of like cars and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so it's not like they're initiating force against him by, using force on him. It's just whether that force can be within the realms, and it's not an exact science, but like within the realms of what we could say is either proportionate or necessary. And I'm not 100% convinced that it was proportionate and necessary, because they shot him with a gun, could have killed him. I know you said they didn't. And it's not super obvious, and like I say, I'm open to things that I missed in the video and stuff. Yeah. But he seemed to be saying help. Like if he was, like, say for example, if he was going and attacking one of the customers with a rock, and that was kind of clear and present, then that changes it and it flips it the other way. So it's a difficult one for me. It's not one that I can just say easy,
Okay, I'm going to come back to you with hypotheticals on some of what you said, but first let's see Phil and Jeremy. Phil, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thought was he seems to be having a mental breakdown. I agree that it's a tough call, if that's what Matt is saying. It looks like a tough call to me. Because if I'm that officer, it's the exact moment that the officer decided to shoot that I feel I would also be forced into a dilemma. Like I felt with that moment when he was going to a restaurant where, I don't know a lot of the context, what time of day it was, or whether or not the officer knew that maybe there was nobody in there or that there were customers in there. But he has to make a choice at that moment. Am I going to discharge my weapon and possibly kill this man? Or am I going to allow him, while he's running around with a rock smashing things, to go into a restaurant where there might be families in there?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So how is he going to behave toward those families? Is he going to stop at smashing cars? Because obviously, if he's out there in the parking lot smashing cars, people are running from him. But the people in the restaurant are in their booth, minding their own business when he comes in through the side door. And I don't know what he's going to do. So at that moment, you either have to say, all right, because he's put himself and myself in this situation, maybe I pull the trigger, right? Knowing how harmful that is, or do I take a chance that he's not going to go in there and harm someone? Now, once we went in, it looked like there was nobody in there, right? But the only reason I, as an officer in that situation, I'm not an officer, but if I were that person, would have shot is because in my assessment of the probability of what could go wrong, I don't know if there's a family in there who's about to get hurt by this guy with a rock.
Okay. Jeremy?
Yeah, I guess I missed a lot if it was only me that dropped off. But from what I heard, last part of what Phil said about the moment of the decision to shoot, I think I agree that that's the moment where the considerations of who could be hurt and how much change. One thing I did want to say, about American police, I've had some like minor interactions with police in other countries, but of course quite a few in Korea. I've spent the better part of the last nearly 16 years living in South Korea. But even in comparison with the UK, Japan as well, American police often seem to, and in this case did, initiate their interaction with the very aggressive kind of fear and aggression inducing tone. That's not, well, the first thing to say is it's not the only possible approach. I think in general, with the American police themselves, their own culture, and also, the American public's perception of what law enforcement can be, it's often taken for granted that that's the only thing that it can be, is just this domineering, aggressive, drill sergeant kind of voice ordering people around. And especially if somebody is, somewhat mentally ill or somewhat intoxicated or in not even that, but in an extremely emotional state of mind, say after a fight with their significant other. You have a lot of circumstances where different approaches might very well be better and be shown to lead to better outcomes. And I strongly suspect that this plays some role in why the statistics of interactions with police look better in the UK than in the US, and look a whole lot better in South Korea and Japan. And so imagine if, I imagine that the tone that the police were trained to use the first time they speak to this man might very well have caused him to remain defensive and to try to flee from them. And he may have actually been in a state of mind where he became he put himself in the position of a victim, afraid of the violence that the police sounded like they were ready to inflict upon him. And different police culture that started off talking to him in a more casual, friendly, de-escalating sort of tone might very well have gotten him to calm down and put down the rock, and ended without incident. So, Americans gotta
would you agree that it must be true that there are cases where a calming tone is absolutely going to lead to a better result, and there are other cases where intimidation is absolutely going to lead to a better result, just depending on the disposition of the person the officer's dealing with? I'm sure your answer is yes. I just want to straighten that out for everybody. Oops.
Oh, he cut out. It was his video was frozen when you were asking the question, but I thought maybe he could still hear you, but he cut out. All right.
Yeah,
I'll
I
give him
mean, I agree with a lot of what he said as well, because and it speaks to the point. I'm pretty sure, and that's why I'd like to maybe something that needs looking into more. But I'm pretty sure he was saying help when he went in there, so that doesn't exactly scream he's going to kill everybody if he's going in there saying help. I know it's not a guarantee that he's not, but it speaks to what Jeremy said with regards to the fact that they made him scared. They made him feel like he needed to flee, and he was fleeing. So shooting someone for fleeing isn't wrong. You know what I mean? So and to be honest, there was a lot of incompetence. It wasn't just the way they spoke to him, because even if you wanted to go in the aggressive, you can make an argument for that sometimes, as Phil pointed out. But even if you're going to do that, there's a competency. Like for example, if they were that worried about him going into some door and not sure what he was going to go in there, they should have engaged him before he got to that point. You know what I mean? Don't say, now he's in a situation where I feel like I might need to shoot him, because and also it's like there might be someone there. They don't know this. They're so lacking in what's the word? I've lost the word, but like reasonable certainty that he's actually going to do something that would justify them shooting him.
Yeah. Well, so I think part of it would come down to there needs to be regulations. Like that's why I think for the most part, police departments, at least from state to state, should have regulations for this is when this is permissible, this is when this is not just make it up on the spot as best as possible. I want to share that I kind of feel sort of the opposite as Jeremy on part of it, but I agree with part of it. I think the idea of trying things out to see if certain tones are helpful is nice. That's a good idea, and maybe it'd work out, and that's a thing. But the thing that I kind of disagree on, and I'm curious to see where you guys stand on this, is I think a big part of the action an officer takes would be based on, are the officers ignored? Because I think it should be this thing that's understood in society, is that who a police officer is, you listen to every word they say. If they say, put the rock down, stop, and then he's going to go in the building with the rock, even though I'd prefer if they figured out taser or beanbag shooter or whatever, I say you shoot. But if they arrive and they don't say a word to him and they just watch and they're waiting and he walks around with a rock and walks into the building, you don't shoot. I think the most important element for why I think it was acceptable that they shot is that the people in charge, say, put the rock down, and he ignored it and then walked into the building.
I think
that's a little further than I would go, for sure. I mean, because just because someone's mentally ill and doesn't want to let go. I mean, I don't know if he's mentally ill, but I'm just imagining. Let's just imagine that scenario. It seems, or he could be having. You know what? I was having such a fever one day that all I could say, I woke up covered in sweat, and all I could say was the word water. And my brother was on the computer in the other room, and he was like, water, what's that supposed to mean? And my brain, an alarm went off, and it was like, he doesn't understand, and I can't think of any other words to say. I rolled out of bed and started kicking my door, yelling, water, water, water. Then he got pissed off at me, and he was like, what's wrong with him? And then my dad was like, what do you think's wrong with him? He needs water. Like, my brain was in a state that was like, that I've never been in before. All I could think of to say was water. It's the only word I knew at that moment. And so that could be the kind of moment he's having. He's smashing so many things so that people will pay attention to him because he needs help and he can't think of anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we break it down, when we break down this idea of there's this human here, he might be mentally insane. He might be having just some random episode. He might be high on some drugs. Who knows what the thing is? I think we have to look at a handful of things. Should our police, either in real life or in our society project, how much of a risk should they take? Should they say, oh, that's a rock, that's not a gun, not a knife? Should they try to tackle him down and get him into a mental hospital for some care? Or should they not have to take the risk that when they get close to him, he's going to pull out a gun? I mean, I've seen countless videos of police officers being shot. Hundreds of officers die on the job every year. And so somebody taking this job, obviously they're taking some natural risk, but should they have to take any excessive risk? And I think that's something worth factoring in. So best case scenario, because I always, when I imagine some crazy seeming homeless person, somebody with like some, just spouting out words, talking to themselves, schizophrenic, somebody that's being encountered by the police, I imagine like, what if that was my daughter? What if my daughter, who I care about so much, grows up and ends up being a person on the street that a police officer might mix up with the idea that they're going to do something wrong. So I like to be as empathetic as possible, but there's only so much risk you should take. And then as soon as there's risk to harm others, you also have to defend the others. And so if you can get this person and get them to get help, that's great. But the question is, how much risk should be taken?
Carson, I guess I got cut off before I said this point so explicitly, but I think, as with a lot of other things, Americans have a severe tunnel vision in this area. And you mentioned how you suggested how difficult, risky it might be to just try to trial and error different approaches to the pure authoritarian conception of the police officer, that they issue commands, and then any command they issue ought to be obeyed immediately, without hesitation, sort of thing. Otherwise, all bets are off. I really do think I have a basis for saying that this is a result of American tunnel vision, and the kind of trial and error. It wouldn't be out of whole cloth. It wouldn't be like trying something bizarre for the first time. We have lots of other models in lots of other developed countries. And we have data that suggests that they get better results. And so it's not, I'm not suggesting that American police just like throw out everything and just try to invent a new method of interaction. I'm saying, maybe fucking look to Korea and Japan and in Germany and Sweden and even UK and Australia, and actually bring people in to explain to U.S. police departments, what they do, and not scoff at them, because I'm pretty sure that most American cops and many American people in general would just scoff at the kind of advice that they were given and say, oh God, you don't know, we deal with violent people. That kind of stuff could never work. It would just get us killed without actually taking it seriously.
Yeah.
And,
well, I hear you.
It starts with not going straight to the most aggressive tone of language in your very first interaction with a suspect or a person of interest.
Yeah, no, and I like to be open-minded to all the various different ideas. We can look at other countries to go like, oh, this seems like the best. And then we can also say, if we try to implement this, and then this is the outcome, what do we do then? So if we're talking about like in Japan, they have better outcomes, that's great. But what if in Japan we're looking at a situation where normally there would be a good outcome, but then what happens if the criminal does X? Then we can say what we think should be acceptable in that case. And so like in my mind, what makes sense, the first time I really started thinking about any of this kind of stuff is hearing Sam Harris talk about it, which is you listen to the police and then you can sue them later or fight the system later or do whatever you have to do later. But if a police officer is getting a description of somebody that just murdered somebody and they find somebody that fits that description, it might be the suspect, or it might be the person that actually killed somebody, and it might just be some random dude jogging down the street that happens to fit the description. If it's the killer and they have a gun, and the police officer says, get down, put your hands above your head, and then the person's all like, no, I didn't do anything. I'm jogging. I'm not gonna listen to you because you have no reason to be stopping me. They don't know that the police officer thinks they might be this suspect. And if they act as if it's like potentially just this innocent person, then that person might pull a gun out, shoot the police officer. So in my mind, if we have a society that knows, if we set up good police anyways, that knows the job of the police is to protect us, then if we listen to everything they say, and then once everything is all said and done, then we can say, oh, we were wrongfully arrested, or, oh, this police officer actually treated me worse than they should have. We can look at body cam footage and we can challenge these ideas. I'm not saying that we shouldn't change up some of our ideas we have. We should look at all the options. I just think it makes sense to say, listen to the police officer demands. Otherwise, what is the point of the police officers?
That sounds like a rational procedure for dealing with American police, at least in cities. I'm from very small town in the mountains. We deal with sheriffs and sheriff deputies, and everything is different here. If I want to go for a walk around the neighborhood with a beer in my hand, of course, there's not going to be any neighbor calling the police and saying there's a guy with an open beer in public. And even if a deputy happens to come by, he'd be just as likely to ask you if you've got another beer for him, as he's not gonna arrest you or do anything to you for going on a stroll around the rural mountain neighborhood in violation of the letter of the law. Carson, I just want to say that's what you described, complying with police and then dealing with it later. Sam Harris is giving good advice for dealing with the American police, but that's taking the current American policing culture as a sort of law of nature. So that applies to us dealing in interactions with the police, but American police culture is not a law of nature, and there are many other in the laboratories of different nations that we have. There are many other approaches that are taken, and I think there are statistics showing that there are many other cultures that do policing much better than the U.S. does. And
it's hard to know if those things will work country to country or what the reason why they wouldn't. But
and those things, those worst case scenarios, those don't apply in Germany and Denmark and Sweden.
Those are some of the most high trust countries I can think of, and South Korea and Japan. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you agree? Where they're actually going to obey what the police say. I would imagine. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That was to Jeremy, right? I didn't respond to
that. That was to Jeremy, and I don't mean to interrupt if you were going to keep going, Jeremy.
No. Go ahead.
Okay. So I feel like those are very high trust cultures where you're going to have good outcomes. I do want to mention a few things on the both ends of the education, right, for the public and for the police. I went to college for criminal justice to be a police officer, and then I decided not to do it because of the way that police, this was with the whole the Black Lives Matter, and the way that it was just insane. And I didn't do anything with it at all. So, and during those college classes, they would talk a lot about how, once you get into an academy, because this was only a process where you go to school for a little while, you just get an associate's, then you go to the academy, which I never went to. So they would talk about how they do these talks where it's like someone pretends to be mentally ill, or they pretend to have a mental crisis in the training process. And then you'd walk in and they'd say, use a very gentle tone of voice with this person. And you have to look for, signs of panic. Sometimes these people have been through really abusive experiences where they're staring at your shoes, and your shoes to them are just the shoes themselves are triggering, and they're remembering somebody who's like dressed like that hurt them before, you know. So they're trying to really instill, like, whenever you approach somebody, try to see it from their point of view, right? So that is in the culture. But there's also, without a doubt, is this culture of go in 100% and use fear to shock the person, shock the suspect into submission. So that definitely is a part of the culture as well. And you can see both approaches. If you watch enough videos of interactions between the police and the public, you can see both approaches. Now, I've also heard Sam Harris talk on the issue. I agree with him that it's a good way to interact with American police. You have to treat the way he said it is you have to treat them like a robot that can malfunction, a killer robot that can malfunction at any moment. That's what Sam Harris pointed out. And that's true, especially because they don't know if when you do reach in the glove compartment that you're reaching for a weapon. And I've seen so many videos where someone's like, oh no, they just keep talking to the officer. They're like, everything's okay as they reach for the weapon, and then they grab the weapon and kill the cop, you know? So that's what happens on their end too. And I think we can't expect the public to have the awareness of like a moral philosopher. We need to just instill in the public, like, this is what it's like for the officer. Because in school growing up, no one even attempted to instill any empathy in the police to me, you know. None of my peers, no one is like, you have to see it from the officer's point of view. He has no idea if you're a psycho killer and is going to kill him. And if he's arresting you and you didn't do anything, he's not a judge and jury, okay? And he's not in a position to convict you. He's not Judge Dredd, and you're not in a position to decide whether or not he should be able to arrest you, right? They need to have these arguments and hash this out in the classroom so that people understand what the police are for, and they can understand how Sam Harris put it, how to be arrested. Mm-hmm. So.
Let's talk a little bit more about trying to figure out maybe how we could word this into some details within our society. What were you going to say, Matt?
Well, I mean, I was just going to throw my 2 cents in with regards
go for
to. Well, I mean, I do disagree with you with regards to I mean, not that it's not good advice, or potentially good advice at least, to say, look, just do what they say, try not to get yourself killed. The malfunctioning killer robots is probably quite an apt description, but the only thing I'd add, particularly where it applies to police from what I've seen on far too many videos, is that, like, badly programmed in the first place, like, you know, like basically defected from the start kind of thing, most of them. I mean, like, the amount of police that don't even seem to know the law, seem to think they have more authority than they have, not to mention the fact that a lot of the authority that they have, they really shouldn't, and it's totally destructive, not just to the citizens whose rights they violate, but to the job they're supposed to be doing. I mean, qualified immunity is something that just is an abomination, and I can't believe a sane society ever allowed that to happen.
Thin blue line. Yeah.
And you know, and the fact of the matter is police were already given the power. This is the problem. While they'll so easily go to like very aggressive tactics, because they know they've got this leeway where they can pretty much do things that other people would, without question, go to prison for, but qualified immunities behind them. The fact that they have extra authority to initiate force anyway is behind them, you know, that regular citizens don't have. They have all of these authorities, and the thing is like, in a scenario where someone fits a description and you've got reasonable suspicion to engage with them, that's fine. You be on edge for the fact that they might have a gun, but that they also might be a completely innocent person who just so happens to fit a very vague description of somebody who does have a gun, and that doesn't mean you have a right to immediately go hands-on and arrest them or point a gun at them at that point. You can have your gun ready. You know what I mean? You can always get ready for what you suspect, and you can always act within kind of like, you know, reasonable from what you have probable cause for. And if they match your description, you've at least got the right to engage. And it's like in this example, it's not that the police didn't have a right to arrest him. He'd already committed property damage. But the fact of the matter is they initiated all of the aggression. They scared him away, and there wasn't an obvious immediate threat to anybody. They didn't even know there was anybody there. he wasn't attacking them. I mean, like I say, the fact that he said help before they shot him, shortly before they shot him, is pretty damning against them with regards to them claiming that, oh yeah, he was, an immediate threat and danger.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's a lot of incompetence on their behalf. But the other problem is police have this whole kind of thing of just do what they say, and all the rest of it is police take that to heart. And even though it might be good advice for citizens just for their own self-preservation to just, resist as little as possible, even if you're being completely unlawfully arrested.
Mhm.
The problem is we cannot give license to our law enforcement to be able to do those things in the first place. And when they are shown to do those things, they need to be treated as the criminals that they are literally behaving like in
For
those
sure.
instances.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we should break each of those down. We can look at various different videos. I've actually been watching a lot of videos on the other end showing bad police officers doing bad things. This one lady got pulled over and the police car stopped on train tracks. And when they arrested the woman, they put her in the police car. And while they were searching her car, a train came and hit it. And anyways, we should look at all the different angles. But as far as this specific video, I got a couple questions for you, Matt, and I'm going to take some notes. That way I can figure out how to word the thing I'm going to send out to all of the senators. So quick question. If he was saying help, once he's entering the building with the rock, should they not have shot?
Yeah, I don't think they had cause to shoot.
And if he was not saying help, should they have shot?
I still don't think they had cause to shoot.
Okay.
I just think the fact that he's saying help makes it even more damning in that direction. I mean, as I say, it's a difficult one because they did have right to arrest him. It's not like he was doing nothing. It wasn't like it was an unlawful arrest, but they did create the situation a bit themselves and then kind of use that as an excuse to initiate a higher level of force than what was immediately necessary.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a couple quick questions, and then I got some questions for Phil, and then we'll go to Jeremy. Okay. So when they pulled up because of the 911 call and he was in the parking lot, and let's imagine for whatever reason there were faulty beanbag shooters and faulty tasers. They're asking him to stop. He's not stopping. He keeps going, and then eventually he gets to that door. Do you think it should have been on the police officers to tackle him if shooting was not an option in the parking lot or at the door?
Yeah, I just want to separate slightly what they have like the right to do and then what they should do with regards to good policing, because there's a level of degree, like they were incompetent to a large degree here, but it's like a lot of what they were doing wasn't necessarily violating his rights or anything like that, because like I say, he had committed a crime, he had smashed these windows and all the rest of it. So they had a right to engage. They had a right to have to take this more aggressive route, even though it wasn't the right way in regards to, like, I agree with what Jeremy said. I think they should have approached different angles. I would say that was bad policing. I'd probably sack them for being incompetent, but I wouldn't prosecute them criminally for that aspect of it at that point. But the one point where I would contemplate the criminal prosecution would be whether they stepped over the line and of proportionate and necessary. And like I say, it was a difficult one because it's not like there's nothing to consider. He was going in there. He did have a rock. He had shown some level of, not violence to anybody at that point, though. It was only property damage at that point. And like I say, the fact that he was saying help, even without saying help, they can't establish a reasonable certainty that he's about to hurt anybody. They didn't see anybody there. And it was their own, they kind of made him run away. Again, he was fleeing as well. This is the other thing. He's not attacking. He's fleeing. So all these things don't really justify potentially lethal force, which is what shooting somebody obviously is. So sorry.
Yeah. So it's all right. So let's just wrap it up real quick. What you think, not necessarily what you think the best thing to do, but more so what is able and works. So if when they first approached him, they don't have anything to taser or knock him down with from afar, our options are tackle or keep following him. would you say that they should be obligated to tackle him not knowing if he has a knife or gun or anything like that? Or would you say the better option would have been to let him go into the building and then to follow him into the building? Because in my mind, in the Vegas sense, those are kind of the only two options. Give a quick answer to that, and then I'm going to hop to Phil.
Well, I think they should have tackled him before, like, they put themselves into a position of shooting him. You know what I mean? Like, they should have got closer to him before he got to the point where he was about to enter the building and tackled him before that. It was their own cowardice that kind of kept them away. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And
right
then
before, I just want to mention that I've seen videos where a guy yells "help, help, help, help" during a traffic stop while the officer's trying to arrest him. It's just him and the officer, and some bystander who actually didn't know what was going on, didn't know either of them, comes over and grabs onto the back of the officer, and then the initial guy who was getting arrested pulls out the officer's gun, kills the officer right there, and then runs away. Like, people will say anything. They'll say, "I can't breathe," over and over and over. That's a big one. They will say anything. So what he's saying might just be part of their psychological warfare, for lack of a better term.
No, that's a good point. But also,
you don't have to.
I think Matt accepted that whether the help was there or not, the help gives us an idea of something, but it wouldn't have dictated any part of their job. Correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
it was
so
just
they
more
should have-
damning.
So Matt thinks they should have, they should be obligated to tackle him at some point from what we've seen before he went in the building, and the help part wouldn't necessarily matter. But yeah, Phil, I think you make a good point. Phil, what would you say as far as if you agree or disagree on the tackling, and if you accept the shooting or not, or should have he been followed inside of the building?
I might have misinterpreted what I saw because I thought that they were trying to catch up with him and couldn't. But if it's true that they were chasing but maintaining a distance intentionally, then yeah, because I know that British police use what they call swarming. I don't know if they're required to have a certain number of people before they're able to close that distance. But if somebody has, whether it's a knife, a rock, a bat, whatever it is, they use that swarming tactic, so they close the distance when there's a deadly weapon. So, maybe we should try something like that. I don't know. But in this case, they were trying to access a less than lethal weapon. It wasn't working. I don't know. I think maybe he was chasing him the whole time and trying to catch him. I might have misinterpreted what I saw. And then what was your second question?
So the question is, do you think they should be obligated to tackle him even though they don't know if he has like a knife or a gun? Or should it basically have, considering that they couldn't get a less lethal way of stopping him before entering the building, do you think that they did the right thing to shoot him? Or the third option, should they have followed him into the building, or would have that been too risky to potential citizens in the building?
Under the conditions where we saw in this video and where we generally have with our American policing that we see recorded, I do think at that moment that he goes into the restaurant, there's a lot of discretion, right? If that guy went into the restaurant and bashed someone's head with a rock and killed them, I still would not fire or prosecute the officer. And if he shot him and killed him, I still wouldn't, because it would just be a really tough decision to make, and they can't make the 100% perfect decision every time. There are cases where I would fire him, like when Philando Castile was basically murdered. I would not only have fired the officer, which they did, but I would have sent him to prison, which they didn't. So each case is a little different, and we just have to assess how bad of a decision did they make.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and we could try to word that range in our details that we write up for the website and whatnot. We could have a range for, in this situation. Yeah, basically the discretion you were talking about, which is complicated. Okay, and so okay, and just to verify real quick with Matt, you think the obligation should have been the tackle, and therefore it should have been within their training and the regulation and the handbooks of the police that in that direct case, shooting is not acceptable. Therefore, if the cop did do that, he went against his training and would be fired? Or is it an acceptable, just not as desirable, acceptable thing?
Well, yeah, because the thing is obviously from their point of view, they're going to say, they were justified in taking that level of action at that point. And my point is everything prior to that, there's so much they could have done to prevent it even getting to that point. And then even at that point, they still didn't have the probable cause, although it was close because they didn't have nothing, but they still didn't have. I think they would need to have eyes on somebody that he was attacking, not just because as it turned out, it was completely empty anyway. So I think that there was too much of it that they created. They arrived on scene to someone who's in a car park doing property damage, and partly through their incompetence, it turned into that same person running into a building shouting help. Now, unfortunately, that's not enough to say, like I say, to justify the lethal force, in my opinion. I think it's, there's not enough there because they don't have enough, a threat, and what possible threat they do have is partly down to their own doing anyway, so.
Gotcha. All right, Jeremy, you heard the questions.
Yeah, rolling back from the moment of discretion in the shooting. At what point during the initial engagement and interaction, at one point did they ask him what his problem was, what was wrong with him, why he's doing what he's doing? Anything that would give a baseline assessment of this guy's, level of mental health or current mental state or relation to the criminality.
All right, well, let's look at a few options then.
They came on the scene and then they started shouting, drop the rock and get on the ground. And this kind of shock tactic, like in a way that does not discriminate whatsoever across the different kind of person that they could be dealing with. They don't know, is he seriously mentally ill? Is he maybe on something right now that's affecting him? And they don't know, is he deliberately causing violence, hoping to hurt people, or is he kind of out of control? They initially start out their interaction with this pure domination mentality. And number one, I'm just reinforcing the fact to Phil, who has U.S. law enforcement training experience, that this is not the only way, and it's not even the norm across the developed world. And there are many countries where they would start out by engaging him in a sort of conversation, and they might have a gun drawn and not exactly pointed. They might be ready for certain eventualities, but they would have started that interaction not with shock and awe domination language, but with attempt at a human interaction that would provide them information about what sort of person they're dealing with. And during that initial interaction, they could have tried to assure him that they would be able to get him help. And that in many cases would have facilitated the guy putting the rock down, getting on the ground, and being willing to accept help from people who are presenting themselves as helpers to him rather than antagonists and pursuers and a frightening force of harm against this man who they know at that point they know very little about.
I think all three of us agree on that point, that I think that was the wrong way to approach it. And I think, Carson, you might disagree with the three of us on that, right?
Slightly. I'm open to the idea of I'm not open to the idea of sending a licensed therapist or that idea you hear about all the time, instead of somebody that's trained in self-defense. But I am open to police in general, especially the ones that are on the ground, being trained in various ways to detect mental health issues and whatever we have the capability of, and therefore also having different approaches for how they talk in different ways. And people being, if we recognize talking in a better way will lead to a better outcome, that's great. So Jeremy, We definitely all agree that if they were to say, "Hey, what's up, buddy? What's your problem? We can get you some help. Just put the rock down," and then he puts the rock down and they get him help. That's great. So what if they talk nicely and they say, "What's your is everything okay? We want to get you help," and then it starts playing out how it played out in the video.
If they had started with a more
our society can say start off with the nice approach, and then we can point out what would we do if the guy reacted how he did in the video.
Well, I think the reaction would have indicated something very different if they were saying, they were asking him, "Hey man, why are you doing this? What's wrong? And we can get you some help." And then without even giving them an answer, he just kept the rock in his hand and turned and ran away from him. One thing that it could indicate, maybe not, seeing the description of the guy, but sometimes, especially in the US, also in other countries, it can indicate, a lack of language.
Okay. So let's say he starts.
So he might not even understand what they're saying to him.
Yeah. So he starts talking in some language and they clearly can't understand him. He can't understand them. Okay. And then it plays out how it was in the video.
And then he's running away and he keeps getting the rock in his hand, one reasonable thing is, if somebody looks like there's even a chance that they might not be understanding your language, you can try to communicate non-verbally, like putting the rock, like your hand holding the rock and then putting it on the ground, kind of a gesture, and or using simpler language. Oftentimes I think police are using this very official sounding language that would be harder for somebody who's very basic English speaker to understand. When you could just say single word, just say down, okay, down, kind of thing.
So if you're up for it, I think what I might have you do is actually write out kind of guidelines of how police should act in this situation from the video we saw. But as far as this talk right now, I'm just going to challenge you as hard as possible. So no matter what you're going to say, I'm going to say he ignores it and does what the guy does in the video.
Look, I'm not saying I can pull all of the suggestions out of my ass as somebody who's not in this field whatsoever. I'm saying, I'm saying that there are countries who do things very differently, and they seem to be producing better results.
And I think we should learn from those. And I think we should make notes of all the things that the officers should do at first. And then what I'm curious to see is what we should tell the officers as officer trainers if we are writing the manual for what happens if it plays out like this video. And it wouldn't matter if we say that we can tell because of officer training he's schizophrenic, and then still the guy plays out how he did, or if he's Japanese and he doesn't understand the language and it plays out. What I'm curious is, no matter what we come up with, and if each different case would lead you to a different answer, that's fine. But what happens when it plays out how it played out in this? Is it acceptable to force the police officers to tell them that without knowing if he has a knife or a gun hidden, that they should actually use their own bodies to tackle him? Or should they shoot him when he's trying to go in the door? Or should they not shoot and follow him in? I think it has to be one of those three, if no matter what happens, it leads to what we saw.
I mean, there are many countries where this level of police would not even have firearms, and so their only option at that point would be to close the distance, and so of course that's what they.
But then the question would be, if they don't have firearms, and then the guy goes in and he starts smashing every customer's head in with a rock, do we now give our police guns or whatever? So I'm just saying, with the options of only having guns, the ability to tackle, and the ability to follow and not tackle or use guns, would you say at this point of what we saw in the video, should they be obligated to tackle even if there might be a knife or a gun on the guy? Should they shoot just like they did because the guy didn't stop and he had a rock? Or should they follow him in, and let's imagine the restaurant's full of people?
I think it's 2 out of the 3.
Okay, which tackle if they can and then follow if they can't.
Yeah, well, yeah, well, it's like they've got a choice, like because there's two conversations here as well. I think we have to distinguish. There's what they should have done, which is a lot of what Jeremy's been speaking about, and then there's what they have like within the realms of their right to do. You know, like what we're giving them the authority. To do.
So I'm saying, what's the right to do if we try anything Jeremy could say?
Yeah, I'm saying that within the realms of what they had the right to do, they could have either followed him in, or they could have tackled him before he went in. They had either of those options available to them, which is why they didn't have the right to shoot him.
Yeah, and that's fair. I'm just wondering if Jeremy feels the same way.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step in.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. That's exactly what I'm wondering.
You know, there's part of me, you know, as a libertarian and as somebody who's grown up with guns and fired plenty of guns, there's part of me that says, well, you know, as long as they're not, you know, being given a higher caste status sort of thing, or, you know, a higher moral tier of human being, as long as some citizen such as myself who felt threatened and unsure about what one of these killer robot police officers was doing in a certain situation, felt that the cop might be potentially harming innocence, and I fired my weapon, taking down the cop, as long as I would be completely legally protected and defended, you know, culturally defended, which of course is nonsense. I would be severely prosecuted. So as long as that current extreme double standard in the U.S. We're not in place, then that would give me more support for cops who shoot people under these discretionary circumstances. But in fact, you know, even if I was shooting a cop who I thought was going to harm others, then the book would be thrown at me. But even if I shot another non-police officer, citizen who was doing something threatening, I'd probably have to hire some pretty expensive lawyers to get me cleared out of those charges for firing my weapon under a lot of circumstances. And I wouldn't be held to the same, you know, velvet glove standard that U.S. cops are held to.
Jeremy, I have to stop you. I have to stop you because you're the master of saying things that I find interesting that I want to hear, but not answering questions.
Okay, so what's the exact question? I'm sorry.
You're good. All these topics, everything you branch off to, I want to talk about these things, but just for figuring this out, and then we can add more details and word around. What I'm saying is, if the police show up, and they've read their manual and they know what they're allowed to do. It's this situation. We can try talking to them nicely. We can find out that they're Japanese and can't speak English. We can find out that they're schizophrenic. We can find out a variety of different things that might lead to slightly different outcomes. Now, in my mind, I don't think I would want to obligate police officers to tackle somebody that has a weapon. That even if part of my concern is they might have a knife or a gun on them, but another part of my concern is if they go to tackle him, he could use that rock to smash him in the head. And now they have a gun. So the question, and it's fine. It's a perfectly fine answer to say that if somebody is not seen to have a weapon on a gun or a knife on them, that tackling is the right thing. So my question is, do you think they should be obligated to tackle, risking their own lives? Which is a totally fine answer. That's the one Matt has. Or should they be allowed to shoot once the person's at the door because of the going in? And let's say there's 30 people inside this restaurant and the guy's going in with a rock and not listening to the police. Or should at that point they follow him in, and then a handful of scenarios can play out however they play out. Or you could even do a combination of the two. You should say they should try to tackle, and if they can't, they follow, like Matt says.
I mean, maybe they okay. So this is closer. I hope this is answering your question. Yeah, maybe they should bring on significant increased risk to their own lives in order to protect the risk to the people who are allegedly under their charge, the people who they're supposed to serve and protect and serve in the motto. You know, I can't help but compare it to other professions. You know, firefighters. You know, they go into a burning structure they gotta have a commitment to significantly risk their lives to save the people who are placed under their charge by virtue of their accepting that profession. You know, there's got to be a significant degree to which, if the structure is in danger of collapsing, the firefighter goes a little bit further to pull the child out, rather than saying, "Shit, I've got to save myself first," and just turning around and getting out. You know, and there's some degree there where they're not going to keep going in just on the chance that somebody's there. But if they see somebody a ways ahead, you know, hell yes, the firefighter should feel professionally obligated to significantly increase the risk to their own life to save that other person. If you're a emergency room doctor or nurse, somebody comes in with a gunshot wound or a stabbing wound, you don't know. They probably are involved in gang violence somehow. Maybe they've got a weapon. Maybe they're out of control. You know, maybe while you're assessing their vital injuries, as part of your profession in the emergency room, they're gonna pull out the knife that you didn't see and put your life in danger.
Okay.
When you're a professional taking charge over other people who are under your care, then there is a certain degree to which you are saying that you're willing to undertake a personal sacrifice. And I think what I see is an attitude of protecting one another among U.S. police, often in strong preference to actually protecting and serving other people.
Well, let's
in
not
the
go.
community,
Let's not go
not
that route.
opposite.
I mean,
that it doesn't exist among firefighters. It doesn't exist among emergency room professionals, and it absolutely does not exist among teachers when it comes to fellow teachers abusing students.
There's just so many routes we could go to figuring out what would be best for our society, and tearing apart other societies. I don't know if there's a benefit to it. It might be worth a conversation, but like ideas of what we think are wrong within, if we want to write something about what police can't do as far as how they protect each other, then we could write that in. But
that would be a good question, actually. Sorry to interject, but that would be a good question, which I have my answer for, obviously, is but to ask, you know, should police have extra like rights or authorities or, you know, powers or whatever with regards? I mean, I don't think they should, and I don't think they need them to enforce proper laws. But that would be a question worth putting to a vote and seeing what people think about.
Yeah,
I'll say very simply, it encapsulates a lot.
Okay.
If you want to choose to accept that job and accept that role in society, it should feel a lot worse to you, the possibility of ever killing an innocent person who was not actually in danger of causing any harm. That should feel like 10 times worse to you than the possibility of losing your own life. And if it doesn't, then you should fucking not be in that profession.
I strongly disagree, but I hear what you're saying, but I there are like when people talk about
I agree with. I mean, isn't that asking like a supernatural kind of moral outlook? Or at least superhuman?
I think firefighters make that kind of a strong personal sacrifice regularly.
I don't think they do.
I don't think so. No, I mean they're afraid. They do their job anyway. I mean, I've done a job where I climb 100 feet in the air, and you know, it's not to save someone. And sometimes you're not always hooked in the way you should be. And you just have to do it, even though you're afraid.
But that's I think that's, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's the point he's making, though. The point is firefighters are obligated to put themselves at risk to rescue someone from a fire.
No, I don't think firefighters are ever obligated to die. So like a police
No,
officer
not
can pull
die.
somebody over and they might take the risk of, I don't know what the numbers are, but it happens where the person they're pulling over has a warrant and they don't want to get arrested, so they shoot the cop. Cops have this natural risk they're taking with stuff like that. They have to pull somebody over for speeding. They might get shot. A firefighter is going to go in to try to save people, and they might get trapped and die. But I think there's a difference between those natural, what comes with the job thing versus there's a 90% chance that if you run into the building at this point, you know you will die. But we're going to tell you, since you accepted the job, you have to run into the building. You're probably going to die. Or that guy might have a knife or a gun, but you took the job, so you have to tackle him. I think we're just at levels of, in my opinion, asking too much. But I have to pee really bad, and I got to run. I'm going to listen to this, and I'm excited. You guys talk as long as you want. I'm actually not going to be back until I see that you guys are done chatting. But you guys should come up with a handful of things that we should propose as laws about cops in our society, and I'm excited to listen back. And take care, guys.
Yeah, I don't think firefighters, or I don't think like emergency room nurses are ever expected to like take on like 100% certainty of death for the sake of somebody else. But they're certainly expected to address the problems of the people who are under their charge. As their primary goal, and their own security is always in the back of their mind, but their job involves overcoming that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also we're not demanding that of the police.
Learning how to overcome that fear. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and also we're not demanding. It's not like we're demanding that the police put themselves at 90% risk or anything. The chance they take when they pull someone over, or the chances they were taking of hurting themselves if they swarmed that guy and tackled him, or if they wanted to take the other route of following him in and keeping him in sight, which they're obligated to do one or the other because they're obligated to engage him because he's obviously committed a crime. But we're not asking them to do this sort of degree. Same with the firefighter. If he's going in, he's not allowed to just not rescue people. But we would allow him to not, if he's got a super high chance of failure and it's just like a suicide, then we wouldn't expect him to go in. And it would be the same with the police. We wouldn't blame them for like not putting themselves at 90% risk of dying, but we do blame them when they use lethal force when they've got like a 2% risk of dying or something. That's the thing. It's holding them to the same standard as fire people and other professionals who have, like I say, declared a duty that they're like, well, we're going to do this. We're going to put out the fires. That's what we're promising to do. Well, we can't just not do it when you need it, because then we're, negating on that responsibility that we've already committed to. And the police do the same thing. So
I think there might be a difference of opinion in terms of like assessing the danger then, because if you're an officer who always lets someone, I'm in my car now, and if the officer, despite the fact that he says, let me see your hands, I'm always fiddling over here, right? If he always lets people do that, he is going to end up dead. There's a decent possibility that he's going to end up dead, because at some point somebody is going to be reaching for a gun. I say that
Phil?
that's unsupported. Go ahead,
Phil. You mean like in Baltimore or Cleveland or something, or you mean everywhere? Because that's absolutely not true everywhere.
That's what I was going to say. I just said that's unsupported. It's not everywhere, but
also, even if it is true, like even if you're in a place where that's likely, the fact of the matter is that doesn't mean you can't take precautions. Like, for example, if they're fiddling and you think they're reaching, you can pull out your gun. But at that point, you don't have probable cause to actually shoot them. You could pull out your gun because you think they might pull a gun. But until you see a gun, until you've got that, like I say, you're in that percentage of 80-90% chance that that your life's in threat. But if it's just, they could just be fiddling around looking for their insurance details that you asked them for, and they didn't hear you say stop reaching or something. Cops get a little bit too kind of trigger happy, and we've got to give them a kind of to be honest, I like what Jeremy said with regards to the whole hold them to the same standards as citizens, because the fact of the matter is we can all make citizens arrests within reason. Like, we would have been allowed to tackle that person, or we would have been allowed to follow him in, but we wouldn't have been allowed to shoot him. So why were the police? That's the point. And we were, we would have been considered, within our rights to use kind of proportionate and necessary force in the case of like, if there was immediate danger, like he was attacking somebody, then we could shoot him. So
if I was in the restaurant, if he's bashing families in the head, and I was in the restaurant and I shot him, then I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have any problem. But if I had shot him just for going in the door of the restaurant, I think I would have had to spend some money on a lawyer.
Absolutely. Although I will say I am sold on the idea that there is such a thing as a monopoly of violence that the state has, right? And we ask the police to be our enforcers of those rules. So I do not think of them as a different caste, but when they're on the job, like, we're asking them to have those additional rights because they have those additional responsibilities. So we're at, like, that's their job, to be the only ones who are supposed to use violence when everyone else calls them for help, because the rest of us only use violence. Like, for example, you just brought up, Matt, you brought up citizen's arrest. Some people misunderstand that. They'll see like vandalism and then the guy runs away, and then you have somebody who thinks, I'll do a citizen's arrest. No, there was already vandalism. He's trying to get away. You don't have a right or responsibility to chase after him and do a citizen's arrest. It's for when you have an ongoing danger, right? There's like literally somebody being robbed and he's being punched in the face. Then you go tackle the guy and hold him down. That's a citizen's arrest. The guy with the rock going around smashing everything, freaking out. You don't know if he's going to hurt somebody. That's a citizen's arrest, right? You're stopping a crime in progress. You're not like, a superhero. And that, that gets people in trouble too. So I don't know. I'm rambling now. I apologize.
No. It's a valid point. But all I would say to that is you don't have normal citizens don't have the responsibility to enforce the law, but they have the right. If you see an actual crime being committed, you have a right to use proportionate and necessary force to stop it. You can, grab a mugger, you can stop a rapist, you can shoot a murderer, or potential, someone who's put in that kind of risk, But again, you have to act within proportionate and necessary, within the realms of proportionate and necessary. And the problem is by giving police a higher leeway where they don't have to act with proportionate force or necessary force. But the only difference between a police and a citizen should be the responsibility aspect. The right should be the same. They should have the same right to enforce the law. The difference is the policeman's actually obligated to because it's his job, whereas a citizen could if he wanted to, but probably shouldn't in many cases because he's like not got all of the, he's not equipped to or whatever and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is we all have the right to do that. And the other thing about, my whole thing about, the only law should be the non-aggression principle and based on self-ownership and all that. The other thing about that, which ties into the powers and rights that police would need to enforce the law, is that law is purely defensive. It's not granting police the authority. When they enforce those laws, they don't need, nor are they allowed to have the right to initiate force against peaceful people. They can only act in defense of rights, in protection of rights. So they can stop like I say, so it's like with this instance, they did have a right to engage him and even arrest him because he had committed a crime, but they didn't have a right to use deadly force when the crime he committed was low-level property damage. That's and again, like we say, the proportionate and necessary thing. If a bunch of citizens had apprehended him, like physically grabbed hold of him and restrained him or whatever, they wouldn't have. I don't think they would have faced any charges for that. And same if they'd have followed him in to make sure he wasn't going to hurt anybody and all the rest of it until someone did come to arrest him, they would have had the right to do that. But if any of them had pulled out their gun and shot him when there was no evidence that he was posing an immediate threat to anybody else, they would have, and rightly so, been arrested for some kind of unjustified homicide, whether it be murder or manslaughter or whatever. I don't see why we should allow police to get away with a different standard to that, because all it does is invite them to, the problem is the whole, you give someone an inch and they'll take a mile kind of thing. Yeah. That's what happens with the police. We give them a bit of extra authority. They even go beyond what they even go beyond what their authority is.
Yeah.
You know, but even the authority that they do have, they shouldn't have, because it just allows them, you know, like to just basically violate people and initiate force against peaceful people.
Yeah, I
But
agree
part of the
with this
problem
very
is
much.
that there's a lot of laws that actually require that, because they wouldn't be able to enforce, for example, drug laws if they weren't able to initiate force against peaceful people, because they
Yeah.
can't say that the drug user's violating anybody's rights or hurting anybody or anything like that. Same with gambling, same with prostitution, same with all of the things that might be bad for society. It's not, you don't have to advocate for all these things, but you know, there's a difference between saying something's a good idea and saying it's a crime, and that's where we get into the whole, you know, otherwise you'd be policing people from going into McDonald's because it's not good for them. You know what I mean? It's not a crime, even if it's not a good idea.
You just changed what I wanted to say in response very much. I mean, I very much agree with you that, you know, yeah, if you put it beautifully, if you're undertaking a public service profession, then you should be taking on responsibilities that others don't have as a result of your profession. You shouldn't be accruing to yourself a whole bunch of additional rights that put you in a different tier of human being in terms of what you're allowed to do that they're not. But what you said at the end there, yeah, it's a big part of the problem with police. A huge part of it probably is all of these victimless crimes that don't need to exist. And this is what I get into with Carson a lot when he talks about things like unwanted tapping on the shoulder, and he keeps like saying like, well, what if, you know, we can't call a cop, then there might be unwanted taps on the shoulder that we can't do anything about. And my reaction is, well, you know, life isn't all sunshine and blowjobs. You know, sometimes there's gonna fucking be things that are like unwanted taps on the shoulders in life, and that the fact that you can't otherwise do anything about it isn't enough of a justification for state violence.
I'm gonna have to listen to you guys from here on out. Okay.
And so yeah. Okay.
All right. Right.
Yeah. So you know, there's a lot of life is going to have a lot of bad things, and a lot of them are going to be bad actions that others take against you. And it's woefully insufficient justification for state violence that merely to say that there's no other way to make that bad thing stop happening. You also have to say that that bad thing is sufficiently bad that that it's worse than the effects of the state violence would be. You know, there's going to be a lot of bad things that humans do to one another that you know are just got to be taken as part of life not being perfect.
Yeah, true. Although we are potentially going back into our previous conversation and debate on the whole consequentialism versus what's the name, you know, sort of thing with regards to like, you know, because obviously, you know, that is, you know, that is the issue with it. But no, I agree. I mean, that's the thing. It's like also because, and the funny thing is even though we have this difference with the consequentialism versus the principle thing, again, we're on the same page on a lot of these things, because the consequentialist thing does back up that police would be more effective if they didn't have these extra rights and they just had the extra responsibilities. Because, like, for example, to use the example of a fireman, if you, in addition to giving him the responsibility to go into burning buildings, you know, up to a point of risk, you know, like, which is still reasonable, you know, we're not giving him some extra rights to say kick in the doors of non-burning buildings or some kind of extra authority and all the rest of it. And if we did, it would attract a totally different kind of person to be fireman. It's not just because that's the thing. It's like we don't have people who want to serve people. We have people who want to wield power, because that's what we're dangling in front of them with the job. Whereas if the job came only with responsibility, like it does with the fireman, for example, who he's got the responsibility, he hasn't got any extra rights, but he's got the responsibility to now rescue people. It's like, okay, well, that's going to attract people who want to rescue people. But then there's no power hungry people there because there's no power to be hungry for. But with the police, it attracts psychopaths and power hungry people who want to violate people's rights. You know, it attracts racists because, I mean, what better job if you want to fuck with black people? You know what I mean? It's like, you know, it's so it's going to attract the worst kinds of people because of those things. So even though I come from it, obviously from my whole, you know, principle thing, they shouldn't have rights because we should all just own ourselves and that, the consequential side of it again does align with it as well, because it's also clearly the better way to go. You're clearly going to have much better law enforcement when the law is clear and applies to everybody equally, and the people who are actually charged with enforcing it are the ones that have it scrutinized under them, you know, the most, and they don't get any extra rights, just the responsibility. So
I just want to say again to your last point about what kind of people are attracted to that profession. It doesn't seem to be true at all in South Korea. I haven't heard anyone suggest it. It hasn't been my experience. I've known people who are Koreans involved in law enforcement, employed in law enforcement. Seems to me that the same type of person who's inclined towards a job as a police officer in Korea, same general personality type as any other kind of civil service, public service sector,
like a fireman,
maybe more closer to the firemen. Yeah, it doesn't seem to overwhelmingly attract bullies. Like clearly seems to.
Well, I mean, I don't know much about South Korea, but perhaps they have less power to wield. Perhaps they've got more of a sense of duty and service, culture, and that helps. You know what I mean? Like, you know, or plays a part. You know, and I don't know. Did you say you lived in South Korea?
Yeah. Yeah, most of my adult life. I originally went in 2007. I'm in the U.S. now. I've you visited and spent several months in the U.S. a few times, but I spent most of my life in South Korea teaching English. I feel a very different relationship to law enforcement. You can have conversations with them, and even, it seems very common when someone is drunk and aggressive in public that, even when they're using profanities at the police, and not probably not to the degree of punching an officer or something, but shoving with the officer or like resisting, U.S. police love this expression, resisting, or stop resisting, which they shout when people are just doing ordinary instinctive bodily reactions that you would to being grabbed and thrown on the ground. You're not instantly like loosening all of your muscles, being completely physically compliant. Of course you're not. We have our mammalian instincts. U.S. police love this idea of shouting "stop resisting" in order to inflict more violence on someone who's just in instinctive fear mode. South Korea, people, even like drunk people, swearing at and even physically resisting and pushing with officers, a very common result is that the police end up calming them down and escorting them home to sleep it off, and there are no charges. I think I don't have the statistics. I'm not an expert on this, but in South Korea, there are these kind of reality TV police shows, and they do reveal a lot of de-escalation and a lot of getting the person home and peacefully resolving the situation. Compare it to the U.S. shows. I grew up with Cops, where it's basically all about beginning the interaction aggressively and just escalating the fear and the aggression and very.
Yeah, I think American police are the worst for sure. I can't. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I'm not intimately familiar with all police around all the world, and I'm sure there are maybe places that are worse, but. I'm not a fan of them in England. I mean, they're not great here, but they're nowhere near as bad as they are in America.
And I think rural sheriffs and their deputies, especially when when the sheriff is subjected to local elections and can't have his deputies pissing people off because one or two incidents can easily, sway the few hundred people that are required to change their vote to get that sheriff out. That's the kind of place I come from, and that's why that explains why the sheriff and deputies are really constrained by common sense and actually caring about the people in the community in a way that I think urban U.S. police departments aren't. They see things in terms of us versus them. They're a group of people fighting a war against the citizens of the community rather than actually protecting and serving the citizens of the community.
Well, as you said earlier, they've got too much of a, obviously they've got to have a certain degree of self-preservation. I don't begrudge them that, but it's like it's their only focus, to the point of like they treat every member of the public as an enemy, a danger. Like even where you want to give them the benefit. I mean, a lot of them are power hungry and they're just purposely, abusing that. But even where you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, where they're genuinely scared, they're genuinely nervous, and all the rest of it, it's because they have this attitude that it's all about their safety. And it's like, well, actually, obviously, you've got to be safe, and that's got to be something you've got to be diligent over. We're not saying it's not, but that's not, you didn't sign up for the, the purpose of this is to enforce law, to protect rights, supposedly. I know not in this world, but that's the theoretical purpose of law enforcement. And, when they have this attitude of like, they're just fully focused on themselves. They have that, like you say, that thin blue line where they all back each other up. I mean, it's the whole thing about, one of the things that frustrates me is like, and I probably watched too many of them, but there's so many examples of like terrible police behavior where they often get away with it or they get promoted or something, and it's ridiculous. But even times when one of the police will actually get fired or even arrested in very rare cases, there's still all the other police around that pretty much facilitated it or were involved who nothing happened to. It's like, and for the most part they're all just trying to cover for each other. And there's so much, again, like we said earlier, the thing is, if the same standards applied to them, 90% of them would be in prison right now for things they've done.
I think so.
Yeah. And that's not by the laws that should be. That's even by the laws that actually are at the moment. Like even taking into account all the rights and authority that they have that we said they shouldn't have. Even if you take all that into account, they would still be in prison even under their own rules.
I think that's probably likely. And as you said, there are all sorts of people who are complicit in the ultimate violent crimes that we see police inflicting. The people who set the training policies, the people who did the hiring, just the hiring standards, as you suggested, that don't seem to prioritize screening out bullies and even outright sociopaths.
Even the judges, to be honest, a lot of the times there's judges that will support criminal behavior, and you think, well, they need to lose their license if they don't know the law or are purposely violating it. But that's the problem. There's no accountability for any of them. There's no comeback for any of them. It's very rare that they face any kind of consequences.
Even when prosecutors literally destroy evidence, exculpatory evidence leading to wrongful conviction. And then after a certain number of years, the wrongfully convicted person is freed from prison, no consequences come back on those prosecutors.
Yeah.
Virtually never, except in a few rare cases where they're elected and then there's some kind of a political campaign to deny them re-election. But
it's the exception rather than the rule.
Exactly. They don't, even if they lose their jobs, they don't serve any prison time, and they should serve substantial prison time comparable to the time served by the people that they wrongfully convict. Yeah, morally, that just seems pretty clear. This qualified immunity is pure evil. And
Yeah, I mean, I can't even understand, like, there's no good faith argument that you can make for it. You know what I mean? There's no like, oh, well, they enforce law, so they should be allowed to get away with breaking it and claiming they didn't know the law. And it's like, what? Yeah, ignorance of a law is not an excuse for a citizen, but the police are allowed to pretend they don't know the law and break it. It's like,
and also speaking as a consequentialist, you know, I think it very clearly contributes to an increase in lawlessness and crime especially among certain demographics of people who are given very good reason not to trust police, prosecutors, or judges. And you know, one important respect is that, you know, if you live in these communities where police are more likely to violate a citizen's rights than protect them, you know, you can't just go without protection. If you live in one of these dangerous neighborhoods, you've got to take protection into your own hands. And that means having your own weapon. And it also means affiliating with people. And, you know, a lot of gangs get started just out of the need for personal protection. And then they evolve into I'm pretty sure that the history of many gangs eventually evolves into organized criminal enterprises. But it starts with the basic fact that if you can't trust law enforcement and the courts to protect you and your friends, people who share your ethnicity in your neighborhood, then a group of your, you know, strongest young men will have to get together and provide that protection.
Yeah.
And you need wealth in order to provide the weapons for yourself.
And it just makes everything more difficult because the what we would class as real criminals and the real crimes that you want fighting just gets lost in the mess. You know what I mean? And it just, you know, it undermines even that. So even if you had the resources to make something like that happen in some kind of coherent way, which would be sort of near impossible for most people, and even if you kept it, you know, like true to what it was trying to be, it would be undermined by the fact that, I mean, the police themselves essentially operate as a gang, as a criminal gang. They're just the biggest one, really.
It seems
yeah. And it's a shame. It's a shame because it almost seems to be like the perversion that I see in society. I mean, one of the things that motivated me with the whole Nations of Sanity thing, really, like obviously the focus on the law aspect, is because that seems to be like the foundation of like where our rights sit, and you know, when some people can take force against us, and when people are supposed to leave us alone and let us enjoy our freedom and that. And there's been such a perversion of that. I mean, it's caused the perversion of everything, but it seems to all kind of stem from that. It seems to kind of stem from the fact that what is and isn't a crime has been completely muddied to the point where, like I say, smoking a joint is a crime in many places, or gambling with your, you know, whether it's a good idea or not, different question. But, you know, gambling and all the rest of it. I mean, even prostitution, like I don't like prostitution. It's not something that I'm a fan of. I wouldn't want my daughter or you know what I mean, to be involved with it. I wouldn't personally, I couldn't bring myself to ever use one no matter how desperate for sex I got. You know what I mean? It's not something that I feel like is good for society. But the fact of the matter is I can't justify a law that tells a woman that she doesn't have the right to sleep with someone for money. It's that basic. I mean, like I say, again, for me, it comes down to principle. But I think even the consequentialist thing would marry up to it, where making things illegal, even bad things, often just compounds the bad elements of them.
Yeah, I think there's one of the huge problems in a society is when a lot of things are technically illegal and the state could potentially use force against them, but they're societally normalized and almost everybody's doing them. When you have situations where almost everybody or many people across all the strata of society are doing something that is technically illegal, then you have this very, very dangerous situation where there's highly selective enforcement, you know, where you have, you know, all the upper middle class and upper class, if they don't snort cocaine and they're used to going to parties where some of their friends are, but they never fear any punishment from law enforcement. And then you have these other communities that are targeted by law enforcement and families ruined by many young men sent to prison for doing the same thing that the powerful people in society are doing and have themselves normalized. You could say that about so many other cases, you know. It's that's the that sort of danger of selective enforcement leading to very real caste distinctions within society. You know, this isn't just economic social class. There's a real political caste distinction when one group of people knows that their kids going off to college are never in any danger of getting into legal trouble for smoking marijuana or underage drinking. And then another stratum of society has to live under fear that their child's ability to even get an education, to be employable, to be able to maintain a family can instantly has a very strong chance of being destroyed by selective law enforcement for the very same things that the upper class is doing. That's terribly dangerous, and it's one of the biggest arguments for keeping the scope of criminal law as small as humanly possible.
Yeah, because otherwise you undermine it as well. You just undermine what law is. People don't respect it anymore.
You know, a lot of vegans, well, maybe not a lot, but some vegans talk in terms of wanting the consumption of animal products to be criminalized as soon as possible, and you know, I do regard it as the most horrible thing that has ever existed in history. But you know, they're not really taking into account the fact that if anything like that ever happened, then you know, law enforcement resources would not be equally directed across society. You know, there'd be you know, you'd have poor and minority communities having their families ripped apart for the hot dogs that they have in their refrigerator, while the upper middle class and upper class have their black market filet mignon.
Well, they've said similar things
smoked
with
salmon or
regards to
whatever.
like pollution and stuff, don't they? You know, it's like they want to crack down on poor people for burning coal, while you know large corporations can just dump toxic waste everywhere. You know, it's like there's that disparity, and the rules don't apply to everybody equally.
Yeah.
Again,
So
that's comes to that foundational problem. You know,
that's why, you know, all in favor of using the tools of civil society, building strong relationships and very diverse relationships, building bridges between social groups, and you know, advocating sort of intellectual and moral engagement throughout society, rather than putting most of your eggs in the basket of criminal law, decreasing the power of the police state. It doesn't get wielded equally or fairly, and it doesn't attract, currently, at least in the US, it doesn't attract the kind of people who are motivated by the good of all. It attracts some of them, but then those people, I think, quickly find, they got to keep their mouths shut and their heads down.
well, they either become bad cops or they leave.
That too, yeah.
You know, it's because I mean, that's the thing. It's like, you know, the whole rotten apple thing spoils the bunch kind of thing, where it's like it feels like it's a basket of rotten apples, and every now and then a nice one gets put in there, and it's like, well, that's either going to have to come out or it's going to get infected and be like the rest, you know. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to stay in the basket. So, I mean, I mean, like I say, my focus on that like law thing as a foundation is really because I see so many problems stemming for the fact that, you know, we do have that inequality of and that incoherence on what the law is. But there's so much more in society that needs fixing. I just think you need a foundation to do it from. You know, like I think we just need like a common ground that we can kind of all work from, and the idea that everyone has right over themselves, and that we can kind of, you know, no one has rulership over everybody else. I think it's something that people, I know, not everyone's not a libertarian, obviously, or an anarchist or whatever, or an anarcho-capitalist or whatever they want to call themselves, that invokes that principle. But I think it's something that at least theoretically could unite people, because I think a lot of people get a lot of misconceptions. Like earlier, for example, when Carson was kind of characterizing it, of saying, well, you know, yeah, but do we want to lose, you know, like, for example, you know, if we've got an emergency, we can call this national service and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can, you know, you can still have collectives. Funnily enough, actually, one of the things that keeps me hopeful with regards to the idea of uniting people is I remember pitching an idea of the whole voluntary collective to self-identified sort of socialists, like very strong kind of, you know, Bernie Sanders kind of whatever. And then I had the same conversation with a very, very strong capitalist. And I knew that these two people would never sort of come together independently because they would consider themselves to be so directly opposed. But they were both kind of on board with this idea of these voluntary collectives, but they were just calling them, because the socialists liked it because of the collective side of it. And he was like, well, that's collectivism, that's socialism, that's what it should be, uncorrupted, yeah. And then the capitalists liked it because, as far as he was concerned, it was capitalism, because it was free market and it was voluntary, you know what I mean? So he was like, yeah, that's fine. That's just an alternative way of operating within the free market. It's still free market capitalism, even though it's not traditional profit model or whatever, you know.
I think that when it comes to self-described socialists and communists, there's this really huge misconception of who they are and what they're about. I mean, I associated with Ayn Rand as kind of her perspective, but probably stems from other people as well. But I think Ayn Rand has made it very strongly entrenched. They think that, you know, that the fundamental attitude of the communist is reflected in this quote from Marx: "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need," or whatever. They really think that, like, the essence of what a typical communist activist is thinking is just nobody should have to work. You know, the people that are really good at working, we should just take all the products of their labor and then just give it to all the lazy people who don't work, because those people have needs, and like a cult of need, and never require anybody to do anything except be as needy as possible. Like that, I encounter this kind of conception of what motivates people to be communists all the time among sort of rival political positions, and I know some people that are, you know, self-described communists. And that's not what any of them believe. What they actually believe is something morally very similar to the kind of common sense moral position that you or I probably have, that, you know, people should work for what they have. You know, there is such a concept as a moral desert or whatever. And we do want to incentivize people to be productive. So they have all those same attitudes, but what actually distinguishes communists or other socialists is the view that that ownership of capital and activities like investment banking are unproductive activities. So they understand people should work for what they have. Everybody should be productive. And if you're a lazy mooching bum not doing anything, then you shouldn't get much. People shouldn't care about your interests very much. But what they think is that what is productive is actually doing labor, and that can include intellectual labor, like being a doctor or a teacher. They understand what doctors do. They understand what teachers do. You know, what they don't understand is what the guy who who buys a factory and buys the machinery is doing, because he's not spending hours there every day running the machines and making the product. So they view that kind of activity as economically unproductive, and as actually, it's not that they're in favor of people who are no ability and all need and just mooching off society. It's the communist thinks that the owner collecting most of the money off of work that other people are doing within that building is a moocher. So I think they have the same moral common sense that you and I are going to have about it being terrible to just be mooching off of others all the time. But they have this economic premises that lead them to conclude that the people who are mooching are different category of people, and they think that the bankers and the investors and the people whose wealth and income are coming from their allocation of capital, they think of those people as being completely unproductive. And if I had
they forget about deferred wages and stuff like that, you know, when you're making the effort now for the payoff later and stuff.
Yeah. So, but if I held the same economic premises that they did, and the same view of who was an unproductive moocher that they did, then I would reach the same moral conclusions that they did. And in most cases, it's the fact that I understand economics differently, and I think that they have very mistaken views of where productivity actually comes from, that it explains their political views.
Yeah, I think that is a big problem. I think, I think another big problem is what I try to address with my project, which is the fact that, because if you look at from each according to his ability to each according to his need, it's kind of a beautiful sentiment in many ways. And you could say, well, that's how we practice our family life, or in, you know, kind of smaller circles, we do operate in that kind of way. You know what I mean? Like, you know, but the problem with it, the reason where it goes from being a beautiful sentiment that can actually have some value, is when it comes at the barrel of a gun, and then it's not sharing, then it's forced redistribution, and then it's, well, we know where the value lies. And then the other problem that you mentioned comes into play with the fact that they have that economic incoherence, where they don't understand where, like you say, where they mislabeling who is the moochers in a lot of situations, and obviously making the wrong decisions there. But I also think the problem lies where they think that they've got the right to come in and step in and make those decisions and force that. And that's why I think that ethos in a voluntary society could actually ironically, the communists, I think they need a lot of economic education as well, but I think that their ideals could actually flourish better if they united with anarcho-capitalists and people that understood the non-aggression principle and that side of it. They need to understand economics as well, but I think they need to understand that principle and fitting everything into that as well, because I think that, you know, if they did that, then a lot of the things that cause, you know, because that's the other thing that gets labeled at them, is that whole they get laughed at for saying, well, that wasn't real communism kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the one thing I will defend them for a little bit is like, well, we can all have an idea of how something should work, and then you show me some system that carries the name but's nothing like what you're talking about, and then use that to discredit what you're talking about. So I can sympathize with them sort of saying, well, that's not what we're talking about. But then they have a duty to distinguish themselves from that by saying, okay, well, we wouldn't be coercive like that, and that's why we would be different. You know, like, that's what we wouldn't force redistribution. We wouldn't banish like landlords or whatever, and you know, do all of these things. So I think they need to be able to distinguish themselves a little bit better. I'm actually going to also have to wrap this conversation up because I need to go to bed soon because I've got an early rise for work.
Yeah, it's late for you. No, I'm
but
starving.
It's been really.
I got to go get some food, and it's been really, really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, no, I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm definitely open for having future ones and that, and we can hash out other aspects and stuff. And that I think we went through a lot of the consequentialism versus non-aggression principle thing anyway. But I'm happy to talk more about that. But I think we understand each other. I mean, we kind of agree on a lot of things, but just for slightly different reasons. So, I mean, I always think about like if I could get like, you know, massive worldwide support or even national support for the Nations of Sanity project from a bunch of people who were supporting me from a consequentialist point of view, I'd be more than happy. I'd be slightly more happy if they were with me on the principle, but either way, we're on the same page, you know what I mean? So, or at least on the same page on a lot of things. So, so yeah, but I am going to have to bail. I don't know where Carson's gone. Is he coming back at any point?
No, that's all right. We can just end the stream here. It's gone for 3.5 hours.
Oh, well, it was nice. It's nice to meet you, Jeremy, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Likewise. Nice to meet you, Matt.
Take care, mate.
Talk to you later. Cheers.